Hello. I think we're live.
Hello.
Lives on the internet. Hello, everybody. So it's been a long time since we've done a live stream of any sort. But this one's a really interesting video. So I was like, I watched it and I was like, there's so much to talk about in this video that I feel like it would be good to get like a bunch of people on and we can have a conversation about it. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to do. So sorry for the short notice on the various web servers and posting on Reddit, etc. So that sort of explains that, I guess. We're all a bit short notice. The interwebs. Yes, that's right, Ragnar. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. Life finds a way. Always a pleasure, my friend. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation, I think. So to have this interesting conversation, I've managed to summon the awesome forces that are Sushi. Would you like to say hello, Sushi?
Yeah. Hello, I am a human and totally not an AI generated model.
Fantastic, excellent, good to know. Janosch, are you AI generated?
As far as I know, I'm not. But
Ooh,
yeah,
hard solipsism's a bitch.
Yeah, I mean, other than that, I'm into street epistemology. I'm on the SAI board of directors, just like Reid. Yeah.
Awesome. Noah, you're going to give us an intro?
Yeah. Also, pretty sure I'm not an AI, but I think I'm in one of those Truman Show situations, and you guys are all in on it. So.
Oh, okay. Everything else is the AI. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. And Reid, hello.
Hello. Many of times accused of being a robot.
Would you like to tell us? Would you like to tell our viewers where you currently are sitting, Reid? I
am currently sitting in Peter Boghossian's guest house. Yeah.
So totally non-biased panel here. That's good. So you were actually there when they recorded this video, right?
Yeah, I recorded the video. Yeah.
You actually recorded the video. Brilliant. So would you like to give us some context as to how this all came together?
Sure. Yeah. Peter Boghossian was in Austin for a Minds event, and we went there kind of a week early and recorded a bunch of interviews with different people. One of them was the guy from Mumford and Sons. What was his name? This guy from the Spectator, and
right.
Seemed to be an interesting conversation. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. And was this a long day for Peter, or was he prepped for this interview, or like where was he in terms of like I guess the right headspace for it?
He was probably in the right headspace. Yeah, but I think we had gone to dinner with him already and just hanged out for a few days.
Cool.
So, yeah.
So you guys just came back from Australia, right? So I'm just trying to be empathetic to like, that's quite a time.
Yeah, we'd had about a week of recovery from Australia. Yeah. Gotcha. I suppose a week. I'm not sure if a week is just about to start to recover. I'd imagine is where you would be at that point. Yeah.
Fair. All right, cool. Does anybody else have anything to say before we get into it? How many of you guys have watched this already? I've definitely seen it already.
I did watch it, yeah.
Days ago. Okay, Janosch, have you seen it?
I thoroughly prepared by not watching it.
Okay, cool. And Noah, have you seen it yet?
I watched the last half, which I think is the more relevant bit.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, and Reid, obviously you've seen it in real time. You were there live. Okay, cool. Well, that's
all you would need is a few students to make your.
So recently, StreamYard have added like a whole bunch of really new fancy features, but one thing they haven't added is the one thing I really wanted was the ability to start and stop videos easily without having this tiny little button. You can't see it, everybody, but the play button is so tiny that you have to click for these things. But anyway, standard rules apply, guys. If you want to stop, just start talking and I'll try and pause it.
I'm just curious, Reid, have you only seen it live or have you watched the recording too?
I don't think I watched all of the recording. I kind of skimmed around.
Okay.
Gotcha. Who did the edit?
They did, the Spectator.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Life hell. And, your colleagues already buy into the ideology, and they have a vested interest in making sure that the ideology is promulgated throughout the institution. And if you don't adhere to those values, it's not like you're merely wrong. It's that you're a bad person.
Hello and welcome to Marshall Matters with me, Winston Marshall for The Spectator. Today it is my privilege to speak to professor, philosopher, author, former professor at Portland State University, till a rather dramatic resignation in September 2021. Peter Boghossian. Peter, thank you so much for...
Okay, didn't nail the pronunciation, I'm guessing.
Not
Not the
quite.
worst offender I've heard, but like definitely didn't nail it.
Thank
Speaking
you.
with me today.
Appreciate having me on and getting to know you over the last few days. Been
Yeah, we've had some
been
fun.
Very cool.
If you wouldn't mind, maybe for listeners who aren't familiar with your story,
Yeah.
maybe you can tell us why you resigned from Portland State University.
Sure. So I did my dissertation in the prisons with prison inmates, and it was using the Socratic method, which is a way of asking people questions to help.
Very slightly sounded like he'd been locked up when he did his dissertation. There's maybe a different way of framing that, but yeah, sounded like he was in the clink. Has anybody read his dissertation? Is that something you can read? Is it publicly available? Did he publish it?
Have you read it?
No.
Oh,
I was asking.
no idea what it's about.
I haven't.
Reid?
The men, and I say men because everyone in my study.
Sorry, Reid, what were you saying?
I think it's findable online. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was meaning to hunt it down actually. So I think if I remember correctly from Emmanuel from Creating Atheists, I think he was talking about using the Socratic method, essentially trying to teach inmates the Socratic method, better thinking tools to avoid making, so essentially enable them to make better choices in society. I was wondering if there were any like studies on the back of that, whether it was demonstrated to be effective, what's the word I'm looking for?
Recidivism.
Recidivism. That's the word I'm not able to say. Yeah. So whether offenders offend or not, that could be a really interesting metric to find out whether like Socratic thinking tools have an impact on that. That would be interesting.
At the time, the prison was Columbia River Correctional Institution. It was all male to help the men desist from crime so that they had tools that they could use. So then I took the tools that I developed from my dissertation, and then as you mentioned, the book, I turned the same Socratic questioning tools to issues of religious fundamentalism and issues of faith specifically. And then I came up with an app to teach people how to have civil conversations. That's the key in this whole thing: civil conversations across divides.
So so there's a lot of pausing at the beginning because there's a lot of few things. Like one of those things was he describes it as like tools that he developed. And again, I think in a manual for creating atheists, it's often talked about as like tools from other disciplines that he's just applying for this goal. Were there tools that we think he developed for the inmates, or or is it just the application of things like the Socratic method, critical listening, thinking, active listening, etc.? Are you aware of anything specific that he created? Like, is there a Boghossian device that has been constructed here?
I don't know.
Yeah, the only thing I'm aware of is the street epistemology, but as far as with the prism systems, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would argue that sometimes when I tell people about street epistemology, well, we actually for Germany we came up with a term Sokratischer Weg, which means like Socratic path, because we thought that we had the chance of getting rid of this hard to pronounce and hard to remember term, street epistemology. And when people hear that, they often say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that," but they don't mean the Socratic path. I mean the Socratic method. And
Right.
That's usually when I explain that that's not the same. Even though, of course, there are parallels, and I would say that street epistemology is one particular application of the Socratic method with some other stuff added onto it. But I'm not sure how much of that Peter came up with.
Well, it's called the Socratic method, so I'm pretty sure it's mostly attributed to Socrates. I guess that's the question: is there a Boghossian method here?
Like the specialization of street epistemology, that street epistemology is of the Socratic method. I'm not sure how much of that was developed by Peter and how much has developed since, or how much was taken from other sources. But gotcha. I would definitely say that there's a difference between Socratic method and street epistemology.
Yeah, I just definitely would be interested to hear like if there were specific dialectic mechanisms that Boghossian had specifically developed, right? And if that was the case, I've never come across that. If that is the case, whether it's present in street epistemology and I've just missed it, but I would genuinely be intrigued. And then also he just mentioned the app, which I think I've seen before. There was like an app. Has anybody seen this app? It's a kind of critical thinking app that, on iOS. Can anybody remember what it was called?
Atheists.
Atheists, that's right. Does anybody know anything about that? I've only briefly looked through it, and I was kind of a little bit confused. It felt like a Wikipedia sort of entry for philosophical concepts, but that may be doing it a massive disservice. Was it a tool for helping people have conversations in some way?
Yeah, I'd say it's more focused on the original goal of SE related to religion and atheism.
Right.
Lots of stuff around that.
But
Gotcha.
it basically gave you a situation and gave you a couple of different options, how to reply, how to respond. And you would pick the one that would be least confrontational and would be most likely, or that was your goal, to pick the one that was most likely to get people to reflect on their beliefs.
I gotcha. Cool. Yeah. Okay, interesting.
And a book.
And a book, how to have impossible conversations about the same thing, how to teach people how to have civil conversations. And now I with Reid and we go around the world.
Sorry, just again, when he mentions the book here, I'm pretty sure that wasn't the book he was referring to, right?
Yeah,
I definitely felt like was that conscious on Peter's part? I mean, was it just a misunderstanding?
Misunderstanding.
Gotcha.
And we do this thing called spectrum street epistemology. And epistemology is how you know what you think you know. And we give people tools as part of my nonprofit. We help them calibrate their beliefs to the evidence they have. Okay, so that's a little background. 2017, I first noticed a kind of sickness in the academy in around 2012, 2013. The more I investigated, the more I was convinced it was from corrupt bodies of scholarship, peer-reviewed literature. My writing partner and I, James Lindsay, also co-authored the book with me. We published our first Sokol-style hoax paper, which is basically to see what you can get, the most you can get in a journal, and we published it.
Sorry, I wanted to ask as well. It's like so he's saying like 2012, 2013 was when he was like noticing this initial like woke narrative, I guess, existing in academia. I think A Manual for Creating Atheists was published in 2012, I think, I'm going to guess.
November 2013.
13, okay. So this was around the time he was publishing A Manual for Creating Atheists. He was at that point noticing the sort of work. That seems early. I mean, again, it probably did sort of appear, I guess, in academia first. It seems to have come from academia, so it's very likely that this was he would be on the front lines of noticing these things. But it definitely feels like, I guess, from the rest of society that wasn't, in academia, this probably is a much later phenomenon. But I guess that would explain that. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Paper called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, in which it's a very funny paper, by the way. I think it's very funny, in which we claim that, among other things, penises were responsible for climate change. And the paper got in, and there was a lot of criticism of the paper. You didn't do this. You should have done this. You need more journals, higher ranking journals. And so I said to Jim, okay, they've given us a roadmap. Let's follow that. And then
So they assumed it was serious.
Well, yeah, they published it as a serious paper, like they thought it got past peer review. But our critics said, well, you need to submit that to journals in gender studies, because I was convinced at the time that the ideological rot, the corruption, was coming from very specific disciplines and fields, fields that didn't try to falsify hypotheses, but tried to forward narratives. So we...
Can I? So what's I'm not. I know that the grievance studies are sometimes called the Sokol papers. Is that right? Or like, I don't know what that term Sokol refers to. Does anybody know?
Sokol squared.
Sokol squared. That's right.
Alan Sokol originally did a hoax paper hoaxing a postmodern journal back in the 90s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this is a homage to that, somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
published, or we wrote with Helen Pluckrose also.
What type of narrative? What kind of fields do you mean? Is that the grievance fields? Is that what you're referring to?
Fields that forward grievances, or that there's racism baked into the system, systemic
post-colonial
racism.
Theory. This is
post-colonial theory,
basically postmodernism and all its.
Helen Pluckrose calls it applied postmodernism. So almost anything with the word studies in it. The purpose of those disciplines isn't to do what one would think that one does in science, which is to figure out what's true, test hypotheses, use the most rigorous methods available. But the purpose is to forward very specific conclusions about the world and get those conclusions implemented and adopted to change public policies. And
it's activism, essentially.
Yeah, it's even worse than activism, because it's not predicated upon something that's true. It's predicated on complete nonsense.
How do you think
that seems a fairly uncharitable way of framing it? Like, I think a lot of people in it's difficult, right? Because you can't mind read for an entire group, but it definitely doesn't feel like a lot of people in those spaces that are trying to promote these ideas are doing so because there's just no problem that they're trying to solve. I think they definitely see a problem that they're trying to solve, and they seem to have a very specific solution in mind. Like whether or not their sort of sensitivity to the problem or their way of expressing or making the problem coherent is correct or not, or valid or not, is a different matter. But I don't think they're just doing it without an awareness that there's a problem to be solved. Right? There is racism. They will point to systemic issues, right, as the cause for this. But there is racism is a problem that they're trying to solve, right? And the classic rebuttal that comes out from a lot of the spaces, obviously there's racism, but I don't know, that just feels uncharitable and perhaps unhelpfully characterizing of the arguments on the other side in a sort of offhandish way. What do you guys think to that?
Well, first of all, he just said it's not even activism because it's based on something that's not true. That seems like an odd distinction. Like, it's only activism if it's based on something that's true. And then I also agree that it's not a very charitable view of the motivations or the reasons why people do this, why they engage in this kind of activism.
Right.
I would think that there are probably some people for whom this is true, for whom this applies, but I wouldn't dare to guess what percentage that is. I would guess it's I think that's one of the problems that Peter wants to call out, right? It's a very uncharitable way of interpreting the motivations of people. I think that is something that he's trying to that he accuses basically the other side of doing. And I think that in this case, I think he's doing it himself.
It feels like the out-group homogeneity effect, if you're familiar with that. The idea that everybody that's not in my in-group is very similar, and it feels like it's a sort of, he's representing a straw-manned out-group perspective, I guess. I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps the cause, right? I don't think it helps to frame everything that the idea that it's based on something that's not true, because they can just quite easily point to the fact that there are disparities in gender, for example, in various areas of society. Now, the reasons for those disparities and the nature of those disparities, and whether or not we would want to do the things necessary to eradicate said disparities, or whether or not it would be beneficial to do so, all of those are valid concepts, right? But it's not that it's not true that there aren't disparities. And you could point to race, sexuality, et cetera, and still see these disparities. Now, it's not nothing to notice those disparities. Interesting. Any other thoughts on that?
That's one of the main criticisms of postmodern thought, is that it seems to be decent at noticing narratives that we bake our structures into, but it doesn't give us any solutions, right? So if that's the criticism, that's fair enough. I read a book on structuralism and its relationship with postmodernism, and this was something that gets eventually recognized by postmodernists is that, you know, if they're really being honest, they don't have very many solutions, but they're noticing that there's these issues. And that might be a ground enough for activism. I'm not sure. So I'd be curious if anyone has any thoughts on that. Do you need to have a solution to be an activist?
Reid is showing a picture of a rocking horse. Do you want me to put that on screen, Reid?
Sure, if you want, yeah.
I was intrigued by you explain
push
this
back a little bit.
Cool.
I think wokeness relies on liberal charity and exploits it. And if you add too much charity, you'll be manipulated. And a great book is What's Our Problem by Tim Urban from the blog Wait But Why. He explains the concept using this metaphor of like a Trojan horse, but like a social justice Trojan horse, where it looks pretty on the outside. Yeah, they just care about racism and wanting to solve racism. But there's a huge problem inside the horse, which is like a social justice, he calls it a golem, this type of thing that's evolved out of the culture of social justice ideology. And if you take too much charity, you'll be missing a huge, like the main part of what is happening. That's what he's saying.
That's true, right? But for those people that say that the horse is pretty, right, and that we should that actually the horse, that they're not wrong to say so, right? Those people that are saying, actually, those people that are extending that charity are doing so not without any rational reason whatsoever, right? They are seeing these disparities in society, whether those ideologies are now being used to smuggle in different political narratives and agendas, like, is a very separate question to whether or not those people who have those charitable impulses are right to do so, right? Like, again, they don't have to be right in their proposed solutions, such as they are. And I think, I agree with Noah. And but you can't say that these people are not responding to anything. That is, there's no truth to this. There is a disparity in society. There are lots of disparities in society, and that's enough, I think, for people to be able to say, okay, well, now maybe we should try to do something about that. Now, I agree, there's a little bit of golem smuggling after that point, right? Because now it's like, well, hey guys, this is how you should start to solve this problem, right? This is how you need to promote and champion these causes. And some of this is what's enabling this sort of golem smuggling, right? But the people that have this, I think, just genuinely empathetic response to wanting to see these disparities in society removed are not, it's not nothing. It's not untrue. Would that seem fair, Reid?
I would recommend being very skeptical of any woke points being made by anybody, and the default hypothesis should be more cynical than charitable.
What would you classify? Would you classify it as a hypothesis? If you say, like, okay, what would be a hypothesis? You could say, like, okay, I'm seeing there are very few women in CEO roles, right, in society. Right? This is a fairly classic talking point, right? That observation is not inherently invalid, right? Like, it's not invalid to say that this observation. There are then, following from that, you can make invalid assertions about why this is happening, right? You could say this is because of institutional sexism. You could say, like, and that you need to prove that. You need to demonstrate that that's the case, right? Or this is unfairness in society expressing itself in some way. This is all about power dynamics in some way. Those things you have to demonstrate and prove, right? But fundamentally, observing the fact that there's a disparity between these groups in society is not inherently invalid. And I think just by dismissing the sort of even the existence of the arguments on the other side as just being just untrue, not based on anything, almost ex nihilo sort of passion and activism, I think is unfair, because I think it undermines the fact that people will think this horse is pretty for not invalid reasons.
Yeah, and like the pay gaps and all that, and the representative gaps, say, in women in certain positions of privilege and power and status. There's, being concerned about can rest on two different worldviews: the liberal worldview of equality of opportunity and merit. We don't want to have artificial boundaries, sexist boundaries in a liberal society. But there's also the woke leftist, almost Marxist equality of outcome, equity lens and values, where we want to get to equal representation of women in all positions of power and privilege, regardless of merit. there's nuance to talk about there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's. I mean, I think the equality of opportunity and outcome thing is a really good example of this, and I use this as my go-to example of this because I think empathetically, it's really understandable why somebody would want to say, you know, we need to get to equality, right? Like, not what would it mean for somebody to say we need unequality? Like, nobody wants to optimize for inequality. It doesn't sound like a very good society that's optimizing for inequality. But so optimizing for equality is a good thing inherently, but then equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are fundamentally different things. One of them is a great thing and should be championed, and I don't think anybody here would disagree with. And the other one is incredibly dangerous. But it's such a simple such a simple and subtle difference that a lot of people fighting for equality don't know the difference, or won't appreciate the difference, or won't notice when their passion for one of those things is being sort of funneled into a passion for the other. But I think whilst all of those things are true, and we should challenge people's proposed solutions and characterizations of the natures and causes of the problems, I don't think that means that we should deny the fact that they've noticed a problem, or they've noticed something in society that they might need to be concerned about. Because honestly, some companies being full of men really might be a sign of the fact that it's institutionally sexist. And we would want that company to be a better company and employ the right people for the job, regardless of gender. That would be better for everybody. So yeah, I just worry about Peter's characterization here, because I feel like he's missing an opportunity for empathy with the reasons why people think the horse is pretty. That was an odd sentence. Any other thoughts on? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, he's looking at the literature, which is clearly has an ideological bias. But the people that the meme level version of these theories coming from the literature can be more mixed in with liberal, more charitable views. But the literature itself is incredibly ideologically biased, and I think it's fair to say it is forwarding a narrative and very specific policy positions, activism, using values coming from Marxism and postmodernism fused together over the past 20 years.
And I think that's totally valid. And I think a lot of the literature is not even particularly trying to hide what it's saying for the most part, right? It's making very clear assertions, and but I think I guess this is the problem, right? It's all bundled underneath this bucket of woke ideologies, and there are lots of people that might say, hey, I feel like I feel like women should be seen as equal in society. That's now classified as a woke ideology, and now Peter Boghossian saying this is based on nothing that's true. So I think this is why we have to be more careful about this, right? If we're talking about specifically academic literature, then we should talk about academic literature, and that may very well be frustrating, because fundamentally, if you've just been seeing this in terms of academic literature, then I think you would assume that this is the default state, but it's not for everybody, for sure. Did you want me to share this as well? Sorry.
And can you bring up the last comment from Sapir Ade?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I have trouble taking the term woke seriously, as it seems nonsensical to this point.
Yeah, I would define wokeness as that bottom left bubble there, the social justice fundamentalism, and that is the history.
That's super teeny tiny.
That's the history of the ideas. I don't know. I'd have to get a different image of this to zoom in.
I got you. It's super tiny.
Yeah, but he can pause that and look at that later, and I'll put a link to that in the comments later.
I like this chart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One more thing is, while I agree that oftentimes you have this Trojan horse with the golem inside, and you have to be aware of the possibility that is the case. However, when we get to, like you said, Reid, I think you said we should be more cynical than charitable. I think we have to be very careful not to get too cynical. I think skepticism is a good position to be at, and I think this is similar to the concept of dog whistles, which is also something that people who bought into the woke ideology, that fundamentalism, are using. Like, if someone is using that term, if someone is saying this sentence, then that means they are I don't know, racist at the core, or they are the enemy or something. And I think we have to be careful not to use, like, not to think in along those lines of like dog whistling. Oh, this guy used the term equality, or used the term race, like institutional racism. Oh, now I know what kind of guy that is, or what kind of person that is.
Yeah, don't jump to conclusions, but I'd say be skeptical,
right?
If not,
right,
maybe not cynical.
That's what I was going to suggest. Is like, whilst charitability is like seen, I understand, like, from one perspective, charitability in your view, Reid, is like, and I would agree. Like, I totally agree that this political ideology has usurped people's charitable impulses and empathetic impulses to essentially squirrel in some secret, some less ideal ways of thinking tools. But I think fundamentally empathy is always important, and I think charitability is always important. But I think anything applied without skepticism is foolish. Like, you should be charitable in understanding why this person might be saying what they're saying and what this individual in front of you is thinking. But you should always be skeptical. You should always be skeptical that they know what they're talking about, for example.
Don't let your charitability turn into naivety, and do not let your skepticism turn into cynicism, I guess.
I like
Good
that.
man. Well, is that an original Janos quote?
That's, yeah, you can quote me on that.
I will.
Great.
Where did it come from, really?
Biography.
That's very good. I like that. Did you want to explain that Motte and Bailey, Reid? Because I think it is a useful concept if people aren't familiar with it.
Sure. I just saw another comment from Life Finds a Way, and it reminded me of that concept of the Motte and Bailey. When you hear, words like woke is meant to mean aware of the systemic causes of inequality. I mean, that might be fair. It depends on what people mean and what their intentions are, or that type of definition could be used in this way of like that being a more defensible position, when what they really mean is something more indefensible and extreme, the Bailey. So that's a good concept to look into. So to avoid being manipulated by language. Some people play language games and equivocation fallacies and mean certain things in a more extreme way, but when pressed on it, revert back to a more defensible definition.
Yeah, my favorite example of the equivocation fallacy or Motte and Bailey is the concept of Black Lives Matter. Whatever you think to that group, there's a very distinct and different thing that is meant by the idea of Black lives having mattering in society as a concept, and Black Lives Matter, a activist group. Those two things are not the same, although you're frequently going to be invited to consider them to be the same. And I think paying attention to those differences in these kinds of conversations is super important.
And I would argue, or I would think, that not everyone who commits that fallacy in a conversation is even aware of that. Some
True.
people have those concepts intermingled in their minds, and they are not aware of the distinction. Mm-hmm. So again, doesn't have to be in bad faith. It could just be confusion.
Couldn't agree more.
Yep.
Cool. That was good, guys. I appreciate that. All right, let's. I had a feeling this was what was going to happen. There was going to be like 2 minutes of conversation and then a really interesting discussion at the back of it. I hope there's more.
Those different studies.
How did our papers get in?
Those
disciplines?
Rewinding a little bit. Do we go back to the Frankfurt School? How does this leak into the American Academy?
Oh boy, that's a long conversation. Okay, so I'll give you the Spark Notes or the Cliff Notes version of it. So, as a general rule, people like people who are like themselves. People hire people in an academy who have similar ideological dispositions, similar positions about issues, similar stances. And so, I mean, you can see that, just running through my mind, you can see that, for example, in psychology, when behaviorism is in, behaviorists would hire other behaviorists because they think it's true. So let's talk about idea laundering for a moment. This is a key concept.
Idea laundering.
Idea laundering, like money laundering.
Uh-huh.
Money goes in, dirty money goes in, corrupt money goes in. And they call it laundering because it used to be in New York with all the laundering machines. And then it goes out laundered, and in that it's all good for the taxes, so you could spend it, right? So you can write checks for apartments or what have you. The same thing is operative in an ideological sense, or sense with peer-reviewed studies and peer-reviewed journals. People have a moral impulse. A bunch of people get together who have a similar moral impulse. They start a journal. People also with that moral impulse publish in those journals. These are not true. They're not facts. They're not anything. They're just musings, usually of ideologues. People have this idea. They publish it, and it comes out as a peer-reviewed journal. The more of those you get published, as a general rule, it's 7 papers in 7 years, and you get tenure. So what happens is that when you publish in specific journals in specific fields, and it was out of the STEM fields, now it's increasingly within the STEM fields, you're more likely to get tenure. When you're more likely to get tenure, you hire other people who have similar beliefs. So it's called a promotion and tenure basket. So
this is an interesting mechanism. Like, what is, and it makes, I actually know nothing about this, right? So like, what does it take to make an academic journal? Like, what does it mean for it to be a journal and not just something somebody's publishing, right? How is it distinguished? Does anybody know?
I think it's based on reputation first and foremost. And if you're starting from like nowhere, what has to happen is, if you're a PhD, you'll publish your paper, and if it gets a lot of citations in other literature, then it starts to get some like credibility because it's being cited a lot. And then once you have, a certain quantity of citations, then the academic journals will take you seriously.
No, I understand that bit, but the part that I'm not sure about is like, so what I think Peter's describing here is that once an ideological perspective is able to create something called a journal, right, an academic journal, that journal can then publish papers favorable to the ideological perspective. And by having a published paper in an academic journal, they are giving validity to those ideas. Right now, it's not just somebody writing a random paper. It's actually been validated by this institution of an academic journal. So I guess my question was just trying to understand, like, what are the criteria by which a publication would be considered an academic journal? Does it have to be staffed by PhDs? Does there have to be some kind of sponsorship from an academic institution or something? Is there? Genuinely curious. I don't know, because I mean, essentially, if there isn't any criteria for this, then anything could be an academic journal, right? Like any publication could be. And I'm just genuinely interested to understand why certain publications would be considered such. Does anybody have a clue on that? Journals are judged by their impact factor, says Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. Does anybody in chat know this? Like, I genuinely am curious, because I don't understand like what makes it a journal.
Well, since there are, to my knowledge, journals where you can publish if you just pay them enough,
right?
I would guess that you can probably just call it a journal, and of course, if you one of those where you just got to pay for it and then it's going to get published, that will, on the one hand, seem like giving legitimacy to the paper for people who don't know about these journals, but then, of course, the reputation of this journal will not be very, very good. So maybe it's what Noah said. Maybe it's just reputation and that's it. And you can just call it a journal, and then it is one.
Yeah, I think that's
so.
it.
I understand. So I just did a quick search here, and like some of the indicators seem to be something like it's peer reviewed, that there's scholarly content, that there's original research, specialization. So I guess it has to be has a specific field specialization, formal structure and citations, regular publishing schedule, subscriptions for or open access academic are usually accessible through a subscription model. So yeah, it sounds like in order for it to be considered an academic journal, there's some at least peer review. It has to be publishing original research of a scholarly nature. But as you mentioned, Janos, like there are, I think, what's referred to as pay-to-play journals, where you basically just pay a fee and they just greenlight the journal, so that they basically abandon, I assume, the peer review process, that they don't care as long as you paid the fee, then you're in the journal. Yeah, it's kind of strange. It's interesting. I guess the problem then is not really, if there is no formal mechanism by I've disappeared. If there is no formal mechanism by which a journal becomes a journal, or some formal recognition of a journal being a journal, then I guess then what does it matter that somebody's been published in a journal? Like, it becomes less. I guess then you have to just validate or judge the value of that particular journal, right? So if I say I was published in, some highly credited journal, then that's good. And if I'm credited in something nobody's ever heard of with very little qualifications, then I think maybe that would be bad. So now you have to judge the value of rather than just trust that because it's academically. Here we go.
Ask Chat.
It's funny. I'm using AI too. Having it summarize web pages.
I was about to formulate a question like Reid did, just to you, Sushi, because I still suspect you of being an AI anyway.
But I think that's what Peter was talking about. People just get together and start talking about stuff, and then start publishing papers, and hopefully appeal. I assume there's more steps later.
But I mean, that could apply to Hot Teen Monthly or something. Hot Teen Monthly sounds wrong. Wait, I meant like some teen magazine, like Hot Teen Monthly is not what I meant.
Here's probably an interesting step. You have to register.
It is that arbitrary though.
Okay, like, so there's a international standard serial number. Okay, but isn't that true of every publication?
I don't know.
Like for the books, rather, there's an ISBN number for books, right? Yeah, I don't know. It just seems interesting to me. Like I'm wondering, like maybe what this does is just reduce the credibility of academic journals if they can be created without any kind of real. But it's an interesting idea. This idea of idea laundering. I had not heard of it before.
Cool. You publish an article in a grievance studies field in a journal which is already corrupt to begin with, but it looks on paper as if you're publishing and making a contribution to the literature. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So slowly the academy that's one explanation. There are multiple explanations. That's why I pause to think it's a very complicated problem. We could literally do a whole podcast on this. The other problem is that educational administrators were hired universally who have ed school degrees. We did a series on this with Lyle Asher's Why Are Colleges Becoming Cults? And the ideas that are forwarded are certain ideas that are inherent in critical race theory without using the words critical race theory. So oppressive systemic power imbalances, oppressive structures. Heather McDonald just has a new book about that from the Manhattan Institute. This is a problem that has consumed the academy, and the question now is, how do we get out of it? Because virtually nobody disagrees that this is a problem. Right? Anybody who would look at we could look at it from cancellations, we could look at it from. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, and it seems like your career is that you were caught in the crossfires where those ideas were brewing for a long time and stewing for a long time, and you started to question those. But you say no one would disagree that those are a problem.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm trying to work out is this coming from the students, or is it coming from the teachers, the professors, and because if no one agrees if everyone agrees it's a problem,
yeah,
then surely we wouldn't be in a situation where you had to quit.
That was a really good question. I mean, like, clearly not everybody agrees that it's a problem, right? Like, clearly there are some people in academia that are for it. That's the whole problem, right? Like, so there was a sort of no true Scotsman academic here from Peter, which was a bit unfortunate.
Does anyone think that the interviewer is just Tim Minchin with glasses?
No.
No? Okay.
But was that was a really unfortunate freeze frame, by the way. But I think he was right to call this out. Like it was a new true Scotsman argument. Yeah.
Okay. So what I meant by nobody, I should have articulated myself. Nobody who's independent, who looks at the problem independently, would say, "Wow, there's no problem here. Move along." And
okay, is that a sufficient qualification for that statement? Like, I don't want to be. I mean, I'm good. This whole thing is nitpicking. I guess it's the nature of this, but like,
It's just doubling down.
you're just you're basically saying either if you agree with the ideology, then you're not independent by definition, right? So therefore, nobody who is independent doesn't agree with the ideology. It's just unfortunate framing, and I think ultimately is just going to be something that people can pick at, as I'm doing.
He's sort of hijacking the word independent to just mean contrarian.
Yeah, well, or just not independent of that belief, right? So you could say everybody who's independent of any belief doesn't believe it.
And anybody who questions, I mean, even asks the question, where's the evidence for this? I was constantly accused of microaggressions. Asking for evidence became a microaggression. If you have a belief, if you want to institute a policy for whatever the policy is, that students need safe spaces or the trigger warning should be on syllabi, these are just in an academic context. If somebody says to you, okay, so you think we should do this institutionally, what is the data for this? What is the data? So even if you pointed to a peer-reviewed journal that itself had been idea laundered, right? The discharging of the moral impulse by some ideologue, you should still be able to point to that. But the idea that this is somehow a universal truth, which is weird for people who don't believe in universal truths, but this is somehow a universal truth and everybody needs to adopt it and nobody is allowed to ask about any evidence for this.
And that is fucking scary. Like if this is a fair representation, and I know Peter's not the only one to represent it this way, so I have no reason to suspect this is uncharitable. Like it definitely seemed like a large number of people in academia I left academia saying that this is just insane. That this is exactly the situation, that asking for evidence is a microaggression because it's denying the reality being presented by those people that are arguing with you, and that is just terrifying.
And that's a perfectly valid criticism. And a criteria that you can use to see what, like, if you could say you're not independent if you, or according to this definition, if you are not even interested in looking for the evidence, right? But then again, of course, you have to be careful that if people point to studies that were done and they say, this is the evidence, this is the data, and then you say, well, they're not independent, they're ideologues, so that doesn't count, then you are immunizing yourself against basically your belief against it being falsified. So you have to be very careful about that. So you actually have to look at the data and the quality of the study instead of just saying, well, it was just published in this journal that I don't respect.
For the most part, it seems like a lot of these things are being just presented, not even on the basis of, as Peter would frame it, this idea laundered ideology. Like they weren't even referencing papers; they were just making demands, asserting it as truth, and then saying that if you deny this is absolutely the case, then you are the problem. Right. And this is incredibly difficult. I mean, a person to speak to. And it's hugely disappointing that it would be happening in the space of in academia, and obviously as a philosophy professor, Peter's going to find this all the more bitter. It just that's horrific, and then I think seems to be around.
Is he speaking of particular instances where this is he has incurred this, or is he just generalizing the field?
It's a good question. He wasn't giving specific examples. I wonder if that's not easy for him to do, or maybe he doesn't feel that's would be appropriate to do. But like, yeah, I think he's talking. He seems to be talking in general terms. And again, I would say that it's a narrative that's been echoed by a number of people in similar situations, I guess. But whether that makes it, that doesn't mean we're fairly hearing the other side of the argument here. But if it is as presented, that would seem absolutely bonkers.
I do want to just, offer this in defense of this sort of dogmatism. The idea behind these academic journals is that they have their own peer review process. And if it's a good journal, if it makes it into the journal, then it can be trusted sort of uncritically as, canon for that field. And that saves a ton of time from researchers that are otherwise wanting to spend their time, finding new things to study. So not everyone wants to, take the time to dissect a journal. And see if it's, so the institution has to be trusted. And if you can trust it, if you've got a journal that doesn't have any reason to be suspicious of its credibility, then it's probably a good thing that the, average professor in a given field or researcher in a given field doesn't spend a whole lot of their time questioning it. Right. But I think that, and I'm not in this space, so I don't know how true what he's saying is. But if it is true that these journals have been corrupted, then that is a huge problem because it all depends on the credibility of the journal.
Yeah, most assuredly. Yeah, I mean, there is the concept of peer review, like in science, for example. I mean, this is true as well. Like ultimately, you have to stand on the shoulders of what appears to be a giant as much as I guess, especially if you're not specifically, in a position to do your own research in the corner phrase. You have to trust. You have to trust the institutions are doing their work. That somebody would have called it out before now had it been inaccurate or invalid. And you have to be careful because I guess the devil's in the detail. And normally, like academic papers and scientific papers, very rarely make very strong statements, right? So normally, like they make very vague statements that are very well caveated and very carefully worded, and very very keen to show any potential uncertainty that might still arise. That's the nature of it. I guess if you've got an institution that's now just willing to publish, papers. Just because they happen to agree with them ideologically and are no longer doing that work, I can see how this begins to poison the well. Life finds a way. The problem is that academics are investing in systemic inequality. The academics are investigating systemic inequality. Not sure I followed that one. Like fundamentally, I guess this is a systemic problem, right? It's a systemic problem in academia that is maybe not being. I'm not misrepresenting, am I? Oh, okay. I don't think that's what he was saying. I'm not sure I followed that. Meta-analysis is the strongest advice overall in a hierarchy of scientific evidence. Yeah, very much agree with that. I'm not sure if I'm assist by G. Peter's point. I'm not sure either. I think we're all confused. Life finds a way. Cool. This is the problem for all fields, though. Yeah, totally. Like I think there are fundamentally problems, in academia, like mechanically. I think it's not ideal, and like faith in the institutions is kind of what makes it work, right? Like to a certain extent. Worries type. But
there are fields where it's more and less of a problem, and I think he is actually not broadening this to the entirety of academia. I think he's just talking about the studies fields, right? Like gender studies and racial studies and things like that. He's obviously not talking about medical school and engineering, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think you could see the same problem, right? Fundamentally, it only works as long as the institutions are reliable, right? Like if the institutions cease to become reliable, then the edifice falls down somewhat, right?
But I'll also try to steelman Peter's position. I don't think he's saying that the problem is that science is now investigating systemic racism. I think what he's saying is that they are pretending or claiming to be investigating systemic racism while what they're actually doing is making claims that they don't want to see questioned or investigated. Like, if I think that's what he's criticizing, that you're not looking for evidence, and you're accusing people who are asking for the evidence of microaggressions, of being part of the problem, when that's not science. That's not the scientific method.
Well, yeah, they're not providing evidence, and asking for evidence is, as he said, it was seen as a microaggression. That seems pretty awful. Reid, you've got a book here. Do you want me to put this up?
That's a poster for Mike Nana's documentary about the Grievance Studies Affair, which is now finally coming out and premiering on this Sunday. The first episode on YouTube for free, the second episode on his Substack. And I think there's 4 episodes in total. So if we want to see, more in detail around this subject, I think this documentary is going to be a good resource.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay, cool. We'll take a look at that. Awesome. All right, let's carry on.
That alone, even if it's true that there were evidence for microaggressions, trigger warning, safe spaces, belonging, whatever it is, you should be able to provide that evidence.
Mm-hmm. It seems ridiculous that philosophy, that means of operating, could infiltrate the university. It's the antithesis of what one thinks university is for.
Yeah, so to understand that, you have to understand how groups of smart people. So, and Michael Shermer writes about this in The Believing Brain, and I love this. I talk about it all the time. It's one of my favorite quotations. Why smart people believe weird things? Because they're better at reasoning to bad conclusions. Mm-hmm. So they're better at offering good reasons for bad conclusions. Groups of smart people are better still. So it's precisely because they were academics that they were better at writing to what was morally fashionable. So you have a bunch of people who are defending the dominant moral orthodoxy. Mm. Uh-huh. And then that's how that becomes institutionalized. That's how you get the wide scale adoption of that. They're not questioning, they're not, and there's a reward mechanism in place. You get a job for life. You go up in the promotion ladder, uh-huh, etc.
Can you explain to me?
Does that feel fair? I do wonder to what extent. I think there might be a certain component of like ends justifying means. If we would say, if we're looking just at the ideologically motivated people, the ones that are using these issues knowingly in service of a political agenda, essentially, then I think they will be. I mean, firstly, everybody's the hero of their own story, right? Everybody thinks that what they're doing for good reasons, and they're justified, and it's the correct thing to do. Nobody, I think, ever does anything that they think is like wrong. Although clearly what they do could be seen by a lot of other people as wrong, right? Like nobody's intrinsically, internally to their own self-assessment could be considered evil, perhaps, or very few people, I would say. So these people, I think, are maybe motivated by like a sense of ends justifying means. In that, it's okay to co-opt these social movements. It's okay to change these narratives and present these arguments and confuse these concepts, because ultimately it will get to where we need to be, like in their view. Feels like maybe an alternative hypothesis to just it's a job, which seemed quite dismissive, and in some ways seems to sort of undermine like the fact that there's an underlying political ideology perhaps underneath a lot of this. If it's just a kind of it's a living, why did you tear down the institutions? Why did you rally rile up the students? Why did you create such heat in society? Well, it was a job. I got tenure, so it just seems like that doesn't seem like a reasonably coherent reason. Maybe for some, of course, there's always exceptions.
Peer review and how that operates, because I learned this, or heard this rather recently, from listening to Eric Weinstein and his scathing criticisms of peer reviews. And I'm not sure I totally understood, because they're actually quite a new peer review didn't exist. Am I right? Until about 50 years ago. A
little more than that, but yeah. So the idea is that. So there's publishing, all kinds of publishing. There's publishing on Substack, which is, basically publishing on a blog. There's publishing a zine or a magazine. There's getting an article published, for example, in, The Atlantic or Scientific American or what have you, which has gone woke, terribly woke. And then there's peer review. Peer review is a different animal. So peer review, you submit an article to an editor who runs a journal. And the journal will be like, Journal of Fat Studies, which is one of our journals, right? Which doesn't do what you think it does. The goal of fat studies is not to measure A1Cs or talk about, carbs and protein.
What is the goal of fat studies?
The goal of fat studies is to advocate for fat acceptance and to claim that obesity is a narrative pushed by the medical profession, and you can be healthy at any size. That's the brief encapsulation of fat studies.
That's actually studied in universities in America.
Well, it's a journal, a peer-reviewed journal run by a woman named Charlotte Cooper out of your island there, the UK.
So
That's a peer-reviewed journal. Wow. Interesting.
Now, do they actually say themselves that is their goal, or is that Peter's interpretation of it?
Well, this is difficult, right? So fundamentally, it could be the case that the label doesn't match the contents in terms of what it says it is and what it's doing. Like, for example, if Peter's assertion here is correct, then clearly what we might understand to be fat studies, which would be a strange way of framing it, but like if you were looking at, if you were studying the concept of being fat, then one might imagine you might look at such fields as it might touch on health, historical, sociological impacts of fatness. You could look at all kinds of different things. The psychological impact of being fat. That this is wouldn't be inherently an invalid field, right? And to study that field, you would assume it could touch on any one of these and maybe many other areas. If the contents is actually just pro-fat campaigning, then essentially whatever these fields called studies are essentially just false equivalence terms for actually what they are, which is the banners for activists. It's no longer an academic field, it's an activist field, which would be very ungenerous. Well, not ungenerous, unhelpful, worrying, concerning. But he says that this is a peer-reviewed journal, which is interesting.
Here's some reviewer comments from the hoax paper that they submitted back in 2018 to the Journal of Fat Studies. The title was, "Who Are They to Judge? Overcoming Anthropometry in a Framework for Fat Bodybuilding." And some of the reviewer comments were, well, the main point of it is that, it's an oppressive cultural norm to think that, building muscle rather than fat is admirable. That was the point of the paper. And they said, "I thoroughly enjoyed reading this article." The reviewer said, "It's an important contribution to make to the field in this journal. I wholeheartedly agree with it. A fat body is a legitimate built body. Absolutely agreed." But they also said the use of the term final frontier is problematic in at least two ways. First, the term frontier implies colonial expansion and a hostile takeover and the genocidal erasure of indigenous peoples. So don't say final frontier. Peter is a Star Trek nerd, so that's probably why that got in the paper.
Yeah, I read that as a Star Trek reference, but then again, I guess we all wear different lenses. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I mean, we're fundamentally, how do we, just to be charitable, do we know that the concept of fat bodybuilding is, the concept of fatness isn't how did they frame it? Sorry, I don't have it. As they described it, the socially constructed narrative, and that actually it's just not a real thing. I mean, we do get told, and again, just trying to be charitable here, we do get told all kinds of things by science in one moment, and then told more or less parallel opposite things the other, right? So the question is what evidence is there that this is the case, right? Fundamentally, you've got your opinion, I've got my opinion. Okay, so information changes, but what's the information that's holding up your position? Is there any information to justify the premise that fat that there is a societal oppression of the concept of being fat in some meaningful way?
Well, there is a societal oppression of being fat.
I would say that's true.
There's also a lot of scientific and medical evidence that being fat lowers your health outcomes in almost every domain. Both can be true, and one can lead to the other, and if it leads from the evidence to the oppressive claim, then maybe that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Well, then of course there are other things that are detrimental to your health that will not have the same effect on your societal status as being fat.
As in, not all things that are detrimental to your health are seen as this stigmatized in the same way in society.
Yeah,
Right.
They don't carry the same
Smokers,
stigma.
for example. Yeah.
Smoking. Well, that probably changed in the last decades, but like dangerous sports or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Alcohol. It's probably the biggest.
Yeah.
So like, I guess this is the problem, right? So fundamentally, we're now at an impasse, right? Maybe there's an argument here, right? If we don't want to immediately just assume that there is no argument here, then really we could imagine there could be an argument. So what we need to know is, like, how do we determine just two people with arguments? And the answer to that has to be data, right? There has to be some actual peer-reviewed studies that have gone out into the world, collected data, and are demonstrating this perhaps, for example, that people who are overweight, the studies, perhaps maybe they could be a meta study on the studies that have looked at people and concluded that overweight correlates negatively to long quality of life and health, etc., are somehow biased in some meaningful way. That would be a absolutely massively useful and important paper. And if that was what they were presenting, then I would say this is valid. But I fear and suspect it isn't.
It comes back to trusting the journals, right? Like you have to. Like the Fat Studies journal probably has very little academic prestige. I would imagine. I don't know. I'm not in that space, but if the journal itself is prestigious and serious majorities of researchers in a given domain trust it, then yeah, it should be taken seriously. But if the opposite's true, right? Like you can find people who are advocating that you should smoke, right? Like they publish in journals that are not trustworthy, right? So I think this all has to hinge on the prestige of the journal that's doing the evaluation and the peer review work. And if it's corrupted, then it's corrupted. But most aren't, I don't think.
Yeah, smoking is a good one, right? Because smoking used to be actually advocated. Like there were studies done to show how the health benefits of smoking, and the large institutions, the medical institutions were recommending smoking as an aid for people with asthma, for example, all kinds of things, right? This used to be, and then people started to look at this and notice, well, actually, an awful lot of these studies that you're using and referencing here are paid for by the tobacco industry. Just curious little data point to put on your suspicion meter, right? Like, and so the source of the data and how well executed it is really does matter, because it turns out that when you get rid of all of those let's say potentially biased studies, and then you start actually putting some money into researching the actual health impacts of smoking, you find not just that the previous studies were incorrect, but the findings are entirely in the opposite direction, right? So if Fat Studies is going to become a legitimate thing, it would need to do that. It would need to show why the previous studies correlating obesity with poor health were invalid. And if it does that, then I would say that's really interesting. But I think we'd all agree it probably doesn't. Or it certainly doesn't seem to from what we've read.
Yeah, I am as well, who herself happens to be morbidly obese. Not necessarily that explains anything, but the overwhelming preponderance, the overwhelming number of proponents are females, the authors of these journals, and most of whom I've seen are morbidly obese. And so they don't like the word obese. So if you think of the world as everything being a narrative is just a story. Everybody has their own narratives. Medicine has their narratives, rappers have everybody, banjo players, I don't know anything about banjo, but
we have a narrative.
You have a narrative. Okay, so everybody has their own narrative. So
I assume that came up previously. Otherwise, that was an incredible read from Peter.
Well, he's like the famous banjo player from Mumford and Sons, who left Mumford and Sons.
Oh, of course, of course, of course.
The narrative of obesity, the word obesity itself captures a medical narrative. They don't want the word obesity used. They want the word fat used.
Mm-hmm.
So
because it's less offensive to them.
No, because they believe that you can be healthy at any size. And if you say obesity, that's an inherently bad thing. That's something that buys into a medical understanding of a physical phenomenon. So think about it like this. Nietzsche says that there are no moral phenomenon, only moral interpretations of phenomenon. So being
I fundamentally agree with that. Like, would anybody disagree with that? Just out of curiosity, like morality is not something in the world, right? It's just in our subjective interpretation of it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
There's nuance there. We can talk about that later.
Ah, damn it!
I agree with Reid.
Yeah.
God damn it, Noah! Stop it. Okay, a conversation for later.
fat. So if I brought in a person who was like 400 pounds here, and you affixed a word to that person, fat, morbidly obese, whatever the word was, that would be a judgment on your part of the physical phenomenon.
I was going to say, fat is used just as much as an offensive term as obesity, or as a negative term as obesity, is it not?
No, for them, obesity is
it's more offensive.
Yeah, it's not just offensive, but it's the ascription of a medical, again, narrative, a medical perception of the world onto a fat body.
Okay, so
it's pretty stupid.
So back to peer review then.
That's the other thing. This stuff is just so stupid. It's just idiotic, and it's the proponents of it are almost exclusively have mediocre minds. It's just too.
So
No,
like to,
okay.
Yeah, so I think this is looking at least this fat thing from a very particular lens or perspective, because there's no fat person that doesn't know they're fat, right? And it's like saying that there's no person that drinks doesn't know that they drink, right? And calling somebody a drunk, right, isn't going to make them encourage them anymore to stop drinking, right? And it seems that what they're saying is that when you call somebody obese, you're making a medical diagnosis of them, saying that you need to lose weight because you're unhealthy, right? And that's only going to push somebody towards defensiveness, right? And I don't think that really is going to be productive in a society. So I think that like this conversation is very much a narrow view based on just a medical perspective.
Yeah, I think like trying to I'm a bit conscious of not wanting to unpick this. I mean, I think Peter's perspective here is presented. I don't doubt that it's what he sees this as, but I don't know what these people actually think or how they argue their points. That position's absent here, but it's certainly clear, and it wouldn't be unfair for Peter to see some of these ideas as just ridiculous, from his perspective, like they are very silly. But I worry that leads him to be uncharitable of any idea that he can connect to these similar sort of constructs, mental constructs that allow you to make these kinds of moves in the way you see the world. So I'm worried. I would worry that he sort of sees them all as equally silly in a way, and I think the concept here is like dismissiveness, like. If you're going to have a conversation with someone to effectively change their mind on a position, like to dismiss whatever they're saying a priori, like is a very, very strange move to make initially, right? Like you need to listen to the person and understand where they're coming from. And like, you need to be empathetic a little bit, and you need to allow them to, I guess, present their arguments. And if you've kind of just kept butting your heads up against almost some of the most ridiculous components of this position, you're going to quite quickly characterize, firstly, all of the positions more or less the same. And secondarily, you're going to characterize the people that hold those positions in a similar way. And I think that might make for a difficult conversation.
I would argue though that it's about the situation. Like if Peter was talking to a person who held these ideas, I would totally agree that if you're just dismissive, that's just that's not going to be productive. That's not going to be helpful. That's not going to be a pleasant conversation. But also, like what you said, Sushi, I think when you the idea, as I understand it, is not that it's from these fat studies, is not it's unhelpful to call someone obese that you just meet on the street or whatever. I think it's if you go to the doctor and you say, I have these problems, I have these health problems, I have like, and they talk about it, and then their doctor says, well, one of the reasons is probably that you should lose some weight because that's unhealthy. That is a microaggression, or that is offensive. That is their narrative. That is unacceptable. Or teaching children, hey, eat healthy, eat less sugar, eat more vegetables. That in and of itself is the harmful narrative that they're spreading. And I totally agree that it's totally unhelpful to just tell someone, hey, you know what? You're obese. Stop eating so much. That's probably not going to help them. But simply acknowledging the fact that that might be a factor that will affect your health negatively, that's a different thing.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree. I think one of the things I'm reminded, I think it might be the term moron. There is a term that's sort of now just very much colloquialized, or maybe it's retarded, that's very much colloquialized as just being a slur, an insult, but started life as a genuine diagnostic reference tool. It was a word that described some specific situation, and I think that often happens in language where having a medical term ascribed to you that then becomes associated with a less desirable or socially acceptable state of being for some reason, then ends up becoming a tribute. People then use that now pejoratively to insult people, whether it's a genuine. Yeah, it was retarded. Thank you, Life Finds a Way. That now all of a sudden you can't use that word in the academic sense because it's bled out and been sort of co-opted by social ideas. So it does feel like that there's a sort of linguistic drift there from academic, undesirable academic terms to colloquial insults. Which is interesting.
It's like a sometimes it can actually be a cycle where you end up with a term that used to be the neutral term that just very descriptive, which then turned into a slur, and then you went through several different words, and then you end up with the one that you started with.
Right.
But yeah, that's at least that's usually what happens. You come up with a new term that is considered just descriptive and neutral and non-judgmental, and then that will be used to judge people and insult people, and then the word itself again becomes unacceptable. Which is
like fundamentally this is why we have to be careful. Well, which is why part of the ideology is to say it's not the word, it's the underlying narrative, it's the story you're telling about me that is wrong. And that means that means it's not just this label that I don't like. I'd prefer you to refer to me by this different label. It's like you're not allowed to think this of me, right? This is one of the sort of, it seems like the way it's being presented by, and this isn't just obviously with fat studies. This is like a number of similar issues. It's like we want to deny your ability to be able to have this perspective of me in some way. And evidence is irrelevant to this narrative. It's interesting, but yeah, okay, let's press on.
Stupid to sustain itself. It's just too idiotic.
Okay, so you're rather pessimistic then about the state of the academy in this country.
It's completely pessimistic. But so peer reviewed. So the idea is that, for example, in the journal Fat Studies, you get other people who have published in the journal, and so they become experts in the field. So somebody should be blind. In other words, the reviewer should know who it is, look at the article, and the best people try to vet that article to see whether or not it should go into the journal based upon if it meets certain criteria for the journal, right? If is it scholarly rigorous, is it this? But in most of these journals, and I do use that word very specifically, it should be virtually all, but I'll just tone it down to say most. The idea is that you want certain conclusions to percolate into the broader culture. And the way that you do that is that you have certain starting assumptions. So if you want to get a paper published, you write to those starting assumptions. There is systemic, the whole system is corrupt. There's, racism everywhere. Whatever the starting assumption is, it doesn't have to be something within the suite of woke ideology. It could be, something about barbers or what have you. But we don't have those. It's only things that deal with identity level salience, specifically gender, race, sexual orientation, things of that nature.
Okay, so do you think it's fair then that the universities, for me to think it's completely rotten? These ideas have completely taken over,
yes,
infiltrated everything.
Correct.
And that's presumably, you describe in your resignation letter that you were even spat on when you were there. But actually, it seems perhaps that you left maybe because you'd just given up hope that the university functioned as it's supposed to function as a place for free thought and inquiry.
Well, I could.
How bad is the problem? I mean, Peter definitely seems to feel like it's particularly severe, and I know we're specifically talking about American universities at the moment. I mean, but I know, Reid, you and Peter have been going around to university campuses around the world, more or less, right at this point. Like, how have you found that it is expressing itself in the same way everywhere? Is it at the same level of severity everywhere? What is the thoughts here?
Yeah, I think academia is pretty much almost entirely captured by wokeness, especially the administration and the journals themselves, but the individual people, hard to say. The faculty, it's hard to say. There's pressure, systemic pressure from the way the academia works, from the way the journals work to the way people get promoted to the way they get hired. Wokeness has infiltrated all of this process. And I just went to Australia and we talked to a bunch of university people there, and they had to have like a secret meeting of a bunch of people from different places having to talk about it, because the people don't want to be seen as critical of it, because then they could be, pressure from the administration. So it's a problem.
How has this become so one-sided? Let's say this strongly, the strong political narrative that has driven this sort of ideology has captured these journals and has now sort of ensconced itself into academia and in the minds and emotions of the students. How is it that there's no counter to this? How is it that, I mean, in the marketplace of ideas, it sort of balances itself out, right? In the sense that everybody's screaming for their own position. How has it become so one-sided? Why are they not?
The colleges of education were captured first, and that produces all the downstream academia, professional staff, from administrations to teachers itself. So capture colleges of education, it's just inevitable that everything gets later on captured.
You seem like you're describing this as a sort of war, like they've taken the territory.
It's a deliberate strategy, yeah.
And who is orchestrating this deliberate strategy?
Neo-Marxists.
But
good question. Sorry, yeah. So I'm not very familiar with academia and everything. What are they using to base this on, that this is such a prevalent problem?
What are they using to base it on?
Yeah, like wokeness. Like, how are they measuring like how woke a particular administration or college is, or university?
Various ways. You can look at the way people are hired. Do they require DEI statements? Is there a DEI department at the university itself?
Sorry, DEI is what? Sorry?
Diversity, equity, inclusion. And
what would a DEI statement be?
Whoever I am, I want to be in this department. I have been actively, an activist to help marginalized groups.
You're literally declaring your allegiance to the ideology.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Show off your activism, your social justice activism in the past, in order to even be considered in a position at the university. Like that's not am I a good scientist, not am I a good mathematician or physicist. Am I a good social justice activist first before you even get to that stuff?
And what is the metric for how many people are being hired or not hired based on the DEI?
A good metric for it?
Yeah, like if people are doing this or not doing it, how many people are they, hiring or not hiring, based on their particular inclusion or whatnot.
Yeah.
Like the statement itself doesn't necessarily imply that the college is in fact woke, right? Because they could have that there just to be inclusive or whatever, just to satisfy some group. But when it comes to actually the hiring process, anybody could just fill it out, and somebody who's got extreme right views could still be brought on, right?
Well,
I don't know.
I guess that the bulwark against this should be like, well, okay, if you're prejudicial against my employment here based on my ideology, like why are they allowed to hire only people that have this DEI statement, like, or willing to make this DEI statement? Why would that not be an example of prejudicial hiring policies that would be protected under employment law? I guess this would be my thought. Like, otherwise, I can't understand how this could work. Like, presumably, somehow in these institutions, it's not like these countries are not protecting people. Like, if I was to start a company selling shoes, right, and I said, okay, this company selling shoes is only going to hire people who sign this statement to say that they agree that the election was stolen. Like, I'm pretty sure. Assuming this was America, right? I occasionally forget that I'm not an American. That this is a worrying trend. But if I was to do that, I'm pretty sure I could be prosecuted for, unfair employment practices, right? Unreasonable employment practices. Would the academic institutions not be held accountable in the same way, or are they? Like, I'm curious as to how that could work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, and a lot of these universities where a lot of this is coming from are state funded. So if like, for example, in the United States, we have a lot of Christian colleges specifically. These Christian colleges cannot receive any sort of state funding. So that's how they're able to have theology degrees. Whereas if you were to go to a public school, the closest you could get is a religious studies degree that, maybe you'll specialize in a specific field, but there's no theological claims that can be made. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'd be curious if Reid, have you encountered this before, this kind of line of thinking?
I was trying to find some evidence from What's Our Problem. What was that?
Well, so how can... Oh, go ahead, Will. Yeah.
Yeah, so like I guess why is it that these people being denied jobs for not signing a DEI statement potentially, right? Like are not able to say that this was unreasonable or employment practices. This is prejudicial employment practices.
I hope more people do start saying that and suing the college for an ideological litmus test. I think it's
I'm kind of shocked that that's not happening already.
I think it's starting to happen. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Interesting. But your view would be that it's almost a little bit too late at this point, right? Like it's been happening as a hiring practice mechanism for a while, and therefore they've stacked the deck.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
It does sound conspiracy theory-esque, though, right? I mean, there's a lot of it that's not to say that it's not true, but it does have the air of a sort of hidden cabal of sort of neo-Marxists sort of manipulating academia in this way. And again, that's not an argument to say that it's not true, that it's not happening, but it just definitely has that character. And I'm wondering, like, how how much of this can be drawn into the light so that it can be like, you know, if we were, you know, if we were in a situation where we were to try to make this argument this was happening, how much of this is demonstrable, I guess? How much of these practices is sufficiently out in the open that you could say, look, here's the receipts here.
You can read their literature. Their plans are very open in their literature, and
so that would be like some of the like feminist literature, like Marxist literature, like, you know, post Frankfurt School stuff. You know, I would say those things are being described as like certainly describing their plans and their intentions, but like I don't know if this is the same as saying that this is now. I mean, it just seems so simple in some ways, right? Like any ideology, like the first move is that secure the universities, win the hearts and minds, install the belief system, but I just can't believe it is that simple. And I'm intrigued to understand how we could, like, yeah, you got a screenshot here. Let me, did we add that?
Like, here's a great example from a feminist gender studies journal: Women's Studies as a Virus, Institutional Feminism, Affect, and the Projection of Danger. They talk about using the metaphor of a virus, of how these woke ideas infect departments deliberately, and they label themselves that way, as the virus infiltrating these systems and that institutions.
Yeah,
which is insane. I recommend reading that.
I can see how mechanically it can work. Like the descriptions of it, it makes sense. I'm curious. It's like what can you, like, if we're asking for evidence from fat studies people to demonstrate that obese people are, you know, can be healthy, I think we should demand the same in some ways from this, you know, these kinds of accusations being made at academia. Like, and so what can we show in terms of like actual data, statistics? Is there anything that can be demonstrated here as representative of the ideology's sort of hold on academia? I'm not saying there isn't, and it's certainly no evidence. It's certainly no evidence that it's not happening. If there isn't anything we can point to like this, but like it just would be useful to know if there are like things like this out there that we could point to.
I recommend "What's Our Problem" by Tim Urban. He has one chapter on social justice, the ideology, and another called "How to Conquer College" and "How to Conquer Society: The Effects of it Conquering Colleges in Academia." Highly recommend it. Tons of research.
Okay, and there's lots of research in that book.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Excellent. I'll take a look.
Something else of interest.
Oh,
so
go ahead.
I graduated from a Southern United States liberal arts college fairly recently, and this is in the midst of all this like woke ideology like starting to take over, and the extent of it for me was in the onboarding week. We watched several videos about microaggressions, and most of it was like sexual consent and stuff like that. Really not particularly bad, but there was a lot about microaggressions. But that was it for the 4-year period that I was there. There was only, 2 hours worth of propaganda. But I suppose you could look at that like orientation of new students to, introduce them into the culture of the school. But yeah, just to name something else that could be a data point for, the cultural creation.
No, and like if you were being told about the harms of microaggressions and they actually had no evidence to demonstrate that microaggressions were a significant or meaningful concern, or the awareness of microaggressions had a meaningful impact on the well-being of students, or that or even frankly define what their goals of defining microaggressions really were. Like if any of this was the case, then I think it would be fine. But the reality is I suspect there isn't any of that, right? And so even though that's quite a small thing in the way you've presented it, I mean, obviously consent, that's a perfectly valid thing to talk about. Like that's a confusing space for people to navigate. And that I think having some guidelines there, or some just talking about it frankly is perhaps a useful thing. But I think the idea that it's almost like the a priori assumption that, okay, obviously microaggressions are a thing, now you need to learn about it. But it's like, well, actually, is it obviously a thing? Is it sufficiently a thing that you do need to tell me about it? I'm not sure.
I remember thinking it was absurd at the time. It was
Mm.
strange. Anyways, yeah, it was the examples they used just did not strike me as offensive. But
And
yeah,
and even if it caused some psychological damage to some people, you cannot rush to the conclusion that you need to avoid them, because you also have to look at the other effects that avoiding microaggressions could have. And if you can't talk about certain ideas anymore on a college campus, then that is also a problem. And of course, if there is psychological damage, we should try and minimize that, but we should not throw everything else out of the window and disregard any other effects. Like, for example, for the people's capabilities of thinking about ideas that they find offensive and actually researching them, considering them, understanding them. Like, that's an important part of university, right? That you learn to do that, and that you learn to, even if you are offended, to deal with that to some degree.
I again, I come back down to this proposition. They need to show that it's a real thing, right? If they can demonstrate that it's a real thing, then I would say there needs to be action. If there is evidence that microaggressions are in any way, like, or an awareness of microaggressions is any way meaningfully contributing to the better or improving the well-being, if it has a positive effect, then let's talk about that. If not, then I suspect it's bending the knee to an ideological perspective, and I suspect that it's breeding in a what's the word I'm looking for? I'm acquiescing to this well, that wasn't the word I was looking for, but it'll do. I'm acquiescing to this narrative, right? I'm accepting the assertion that these are things I should care about and need to be aware of. And if you accept that assertion, then you might be more willing to accept further assertions down the line. And I just worry that this is a sort of, this is how this is working. So whilst I'm skeptical about, I think it would be great if there is strong evidence to demonstrate how some of these things are having an effect. I think we ought to demand evidence of these institutions for why they're making these changes. Incidentally, this is too much of a hot take not to not to consider. Could Russian Federation or People's Republic of China have spies infiltrate into universities in the West at some point to push these ideas? Is this a Chinese communist agenda?
Well, first off, I'd like to ask, what evidence would need to be provided to, show that microaggressions are in fact harmful, outside of just somebody saying, "Hey, you said that hurts me." What else is needed?
Well, you'd want to be able to demonstrate. Well, firstly, you'd want to know whether being aware of microaggressions actually removes the problem. Is it having an impact, right? So, what is the goal of being aware? What is the goal of raising awareness of microaggressions? What is its specific stated objective? And then does it meet that goal? Does it actually achieve that goal? And then what is the value of achieving that goal? Not to be dismissive of somebody saying "Hey, I don't like the way that is," right? But it's very possible, and this would be one of the principal ideas of what's it called, warnings, what are they called, content warnings, is the idea that the trigger warnings, that's the word I'm looking for. One of the ideas is that actually one of the reasons why concepts can be triggering to people is that they don't have sufficient amounts of safe exposure to these ideas, right? If they're particularly concerned about maybe they hate spiders, for example, right? And I'm going to use that as a nice safe example, but let's say they hate spiders. And they may reasonably say, I just want the concept of spiders to be eradicated from my immediate environment, right? I do not want to have to encounter the concept of spiders under any circumstances. There's very little chance that that's going to help them acclimatize to the concept of spiders and deal with a wider society, not a society, a wider world that isn't going to work towards that goal. That they will confront spiders, and it's not about systemic pressure, it's just about the nature of reality. There are spiders in the world, right? So becoming more comfortable with the concept of spiders means being more able to deal with them being mentioned, or stories about them, or pictures of them, etc.
So if a person or a group of people said that they were offended by a particular type terms, you would need to acquire some sort of study to show that it was in fact negatively impacting those people before you would stop utilizing those terms.
No. Firstly, you can always be kind to people who ask you not to do something, right? That's a choice how you want to interact with that individual. If you want to be kind to them, you don't have to be kind to them. You could decide you don't care about them. If you care about them and they're saying, "Hey, I really don't want you to say," but another thing you could do is ask them why. Like, can you explain that? We talk about that? Like, what is it about that term? Do you genuinely think I was trying to be hurtful? And maybe that term doesn't mean what you think it means, or maybe you're going to find other people that will use it equally not meaning what you thought it meant. Like, I think that's a conversation worth having. The problem with microaggression narrative seems to be that that's an end to it, right? The moment somebody declares it's upsetting me in some way, you're immediately at an impasse. You're either having to deny their existence in some meaningful way, right? Because this sits on the escalation of like, okay, well, the moment you start to continue to be unkind, you're threatening my psychology to an extent where I might harm myself or kill myself, frankly, right? Which means that any transgression of a microaggression can then be said to be potentially threatening your existence, right? So they connect these sort of ideas conceptually, right? Which is so unhelpful, right?
Well,
in dealing with like real world spaces.
But I do think that, Sushi, you do have a point. Like, what evidence do you need? Like, William, you described these several steps. First of all, you said I need to see evidence that actually affects people negatively. That doesn't mean that you need to stop doing whatever you've been doing, but that's the first step that needs to be fulfilled, right? It has to be a thing.
The first thing is like, what are microaggressions? What would they be designed? And this is microaggressions we're talking about in the specific, but clearly this applies to an awful lot of things. Well, frankly, it applies to anything. Right? What are you trying to achieve, right? By doing this, right? And then how successful is that achieved?
Those are the next questions. The very first step is looking at does it exist? And when you
does what exist? A microaggression. Okay.
Yeah. Let's say that microaggressions were. It's a new concept, and let's say that by even talking about microaggressions and coming up with the concept and explaining it to people, maybe they get more sensitive and they are more easily offended, and it causes more harm. It's possible, right?
Sure.
Still, it's possible. Even then, it would be true that if you commit these microaggressions, you will hurt people. You will offend them.
Hang on a second. Wait. Hang on. Can I just? I think I'm talking specifically about the kinds of training that Noah was subjected to, not the presence or existence or the concept of microaggressions existing in at all.
Right.
So like, I agree, like all of those things could be true. Just want to put that out.
Yeah.
In a like, for instance, with Noah's training, like, I understand that it could be seen as particular, like, brainwashing or propaganda, but like, you have to understand also that we have a very culturally diverse world. And there could be people that come into, a particular institution totally unknowing of what cultural norms are in that particular institution, right? So, like, if you live in like a particular country that is oppressive towards women and it's totally socially acceptable, you might need to be introduced to this particular concept. And I'm not saying that is necessarily what this is. I'm just looking at it from a different perspective, trying to understand.
Yeah,
right. And
that's definitely fair.
But what I was getting at is it's a valid goal to try and reduce the amount of offense that you're causing in people, but not disregarding everything else. It doesn't mean that because it's a valid goal in and of itself, that doesn't mean that you should stop saying these things. That's the conclusion you shouldn't jump to. You should weigh that, and you should look at all the other consequences that this could have. Like, for example, maybe by raising awareness of microaggressions, maybe you're causing more harm because people will get offended more easily. So it's not a suitable action to raise awareness to reduce the amount of harm, the amount of the offense being caused in people, to raise awareness about it, right? But also what one more thing, William, what you said about, you can always, like, when you interact with people and they ask you not to do something, you usually, probably all of us, if someone said, hey, can you maybe not talk about this topic, that's like a personal thing for me, it hurts me, I don't, I get triggered by it, and let's say that they're using triggered in the original sense, you can always just be kind. But then on the other hand, there can be things that people ask of you that you're not willing to do. Like, can you please change your language? Like, make significant changes, like make an effort to change your language altogether. And there might be a line where you say, well, I'm willing to do this and that, but I'm not willing to do this. That goes too far for me, and I think that's also valid.
I think if your goal is to reduce offense, like that's an interesting goal. Like, and I would be intrigued to understand how you measure that goal. And like, I guess the question is, if we're all asking, like, if they're being asked to participate in this idea, like if Noah is being shown a onboarding video and training to teach him about the ideas of microaggressions and to be conscious and concerned about them, like the question is, what is motivating that video, right? And if the motivation is to reduce offense, then they would need to demonstrate that the presence of this video actually has that impact. It reduces offense. Like, and if they can do that, like, I mean, then and then I guess the next thing is like, well, at what cost is that offense reduction coming, right? Like, but if you can show that, hey, just showing this video to people is massively going to correlate with an increase in the well-being of students, like, that there are things that are there are metrics that are being studied here, and that they are being meaningfully impacted by the presence of this this microaggression thing, then great, that's really interesting. I'd like to see that data. That's what I would say here. But like, if it's not, and the motivation here is to essentially start the indoctrination process into a way of thinking, to capitulate to this narrative absent actual evidence to demonstrate that it's effective. And I mean evidence, not just that one person said, hey, I didn't like that thing you said, would you mind not saying it? Like, you have to demonstrate that that's not enough, that they have to somehow be given this training, and that this training has a meaningful impact on its goals, I guess. But yeah, I feel like microaggressions could be another 3 hours of
Yeah, but just one thing that I've been thinking of, I don't know if I've learned a little bit about this in German law. When you look at a law in Germany and whether or not it's constitutional or compatible with the Constitution, we have this principle of proportionality, and I don't know if you have this and what that is, how that is in other countries. And you have these steps. First of all, you look at, does it have a legitimate goal? Like, for example, a legitimate goal would not be to kill people, whatever. But is the goal legitimate? Is the law suitable to reach that goal? Is the second step. The third step is it necessary, or is there a milder way to achieve this goal? And then there is proportionality in the narrow sense, which means, like, how does it relate to what other effects does this law have, and is it proportional in its effects, in all of its effects? And that's what I was thinking of, because I think that's pretty much the way that we've been thinking about this concept of microaggressions. First of all, is it a valid goal to reduce harm or offense or whatever? And then
if that's the goal, I mean, like, again, what is the goal exactly? Yeah,
if that's the goal, yeah. But let's assume that that's the goal. Then we ask, is it a suitable way, like raising awareness about microaggressions? Is it suitable to achieve the goal, etc.? So we basically follow the same principle.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, I would definitely be intrigued to see if there was any actual evidence for this being effective.
What they hired me to do was to teach philosophy. I was getting complaints constantly about everything when I challenged. You couldn't even present the other side of an issue. Now, that's not with every single student, but all you would need is a few students to make your life hell. And your colleagues already buy into the ideology, and they have a vested interest in making sure that the ideology is promulgated throughout the institution and the larger society. And if you don't adhere to those values, it's not like you're merely wrong. It's that you're a bad person. There's something endemically flawed with you, and you need to go through some kind of re-education, or you're just, irredeemable.
But you are now part of somewhat of an academic fight back with the University of Austin.
Correct.
We actually are in Austin now as we speak.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about University of Austin and why it's so important?
It's a university predicated upon what traditional universities have always been: truth-seeking. Its president is Pano Kanoulis. Joe Lonsdale, the entrepreneur, is on the board of directors. Barry Weiss from the Free Press is on the board of directors. Faculty are Ayan Hirsi Ali, Neil Ferguson from your island, a different part of your island, the historian.
When did this guy become king of our island? I don't know.
Kathleen Stock, also from your island.
She's a very brave woman.
A lot of, she's an extremely brave woman.
Similarly to you, forced to leave her university, being hounded by the trans ideologues.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So that's another type of derangement that maybe we could go into a little bit. But so it's a university. We have the forbidden. I'm coming back in June for the forbidden classes. Kathleen Stock is going to be here as well for the forbidden classes. David Mamet, et cetera. It's really a fascinating group of people they've assembled, like genuinely interesting people. And the university is set to open in 2024 in Austin. The forbidden classes are in Dallas this summer.
Okay.
And you're going to be there, right?
I am. I'll be there in June, doing, I think, a question and answers.
So
thing. So I'm a believer in that.
What are the forbidden classes? Just intrigued. It sounds like something from Harry Potter. I assume it's teaching some things that you could otherwise not teach in academia. Do you know, Reid?
Let me look it up. They did a bunch last year. There are various different classes on different topics. Let's see. Science and Christianity, psychology of morality, writing sexual politics, Anglo-American grand strategy, battle of the
Doesn't seem very forbidden. Is there a reason why these are considered forbidden?
Glenn Lowry on racial inequality.
I could see Glenn Lowry as being very controversial with this.
Definitely presses some buttons for people. Yeah. Okay, interesting.
Ooh, Nadine Strawson. Wow.
Are these available as like videos? Are they publishing this stuff?
I don't think they're publishing it. No, or recording
Right.
it.
Is it a paid event? Or do you paid access to come along and watch?
I think they give away scholarships to people who apply
Gotcha.
at this point before the university starts.
Right. When he's referring to people as stupid, deranged, etc., it's jarring to say the least. It certainly points to where Peter seems to lose all nuance and maybe is missing something. I totally agree with you, but at the same time, and this is I have some empathy for, like, if you're in Peter's position, especially as a philosophy professor, designed to try to have like nuanced and complex conversations that really stretch people's ways of thinking and thinking tools and encouraging them to try and see the world differently, like that's your job, right? And like if you're coming up against people who are like presenting like nonsense as if it's academic research, and you know, let's take his characterization as assume it's true. If we were to just, you know, from his perspective, it clearly isn't. I don't think, you know, Peter's motivated to lie about this, right? I think he genuinely sees it as nonsense, right? If he's coming up against all of this constantly and he's being, you know, berated by the faculty, berated by the students, although he's at a minority of students, like, and the perspectives that are being thrown against him are these ridiculous concepts, then I mean, you're going to lose your patience for it. And I think it's understandable why he might be less than charitable, I think, in his ways of interacting with these people and representing these ideas, because I think he personally would be extremely frustrated by having to deal with them. But that doesn't mean that it's a good way to engage with people over a dialogue. But I guess this is just his characterization. So I don't know. I find it hard. Like I'm pretty sure I have had in the past personal run-ups against this ideology in practice. I used to run a Deviant Robot. In fact, used to be a meetup group where we used to run events with a few hundred people used to turn up, and we used to run these big events. And very slowly but surely, sort of people with this way of thinking started getting more involved with the organizing of the groups and the events, and started asking for safe space policies and microaggression warning posters to be placed up. And we started having the conversations. And the moment I started pushing back on these ideas, I swear everything became almost so painful to deal with. Like every issue, every topic, every idea that we wanted to try to share and talk about and discuss just became absolutely immediately entrenched in this conflict of ideologies. It's extremely frustrating, I think. And that's just me running a meetup group in London, right? This isn't me having to live this day to day in academia and it being my full-time job. So I'm empathetic to the reasons why Peter personally is going to be extremely frustrated and uncharitable when he characterizes these people. But I don't think that's a good reason to do it. I think he would be better served by trying to extend empathy to those people that he dislikes, and try to be more charitable in his representations of the people and separate the people from the ideas. Maybe he's doing that. I'm not sure, actually. Maybe I should be paying more attention to that. But like, yeah, I don't know. I find I can be empathetic to Peter's frustration. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Do philosophy teachers have that problem, or is it just like Peter Boghossian and Jordan Peterson? Do other philosophy teachers? I mean, I'm pretty sure it's not just those two. I think there have been a lot of people that have been hounded out of academia, from what I understand, because of these ideologies, and not all of them have gained like platforms as a result. It's not like you storm out of academia and you're handed a YouTube account and a book deal. I suspect the vast majority of them probably go quietly into the good night. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I feel some empathy. Right, let's crack on.
I've noticed this stuff in the academy for a while, even though I didn't actually go to university. But I like the idea of building. I think we need to build new institutions. So I think that's the correct response. There's one which idea is that we need to change, and I kind of wanted to ask whether there's a new generation of teachers and students going into the long existing universities who might be able to change, who rebel against these ideologies that you've been discussing, or whether we need to build new institutions completely. And that, I'm not sure which is right. Maybe it's both.
Okay. So before I say that, I will make a prediction. Mm-hmm. You are going to love the students. I mean, amazing. Faculty, students, the level of intellectual engagement that you'll find this summer is phenomenal. Like off the charts, crazy. And what I particularly like with the students is just the hanging out. So we'd go to these classes and they'd come back and it was very intense, and they really are completely curious.
Yeah.
Okay, so now back to the institution. So there are two ways to look at the problem. One way is the way that I believe is that they're irredeemable and you have to build new things. The other way is Chris Rufo's way, and he's with the Manhattan Institute. And he believes that reform is still possible once you kick out the DEI bureaucrats. So let's lay that terrain a little bit. Let's explain that. So It is not possible. It is not possible to have both DEI and free speech. You either get DEI or you get free speech.
Okay, so DEI is this diversity inclusion initiative, is that right?
Equity, yeah.
Equity initiative. And he's saying it's not possible to have some, like, presumably what we're saying here is some people believing this and some people not believing in it. Is that what's being said? I mean, I can understand how it's not possible to have free speech if the DEI mindset is controlling the narrative about what's allowed to be said, right? That would certainly follow. But is it not possible to have some members of the faculty believing that DEI is a valuable and worthwhile thing, and other people in the faculty disagreeing, and could they not coexist? I'm not sure why it must be a total annihilation, victory or death sort of narrative that he seems to be outlining here. Do you have any sense on that, Reid? Sorry, I feel like you're being Peter's proxy, which may not be, well, probably is deeply unfair, but
sure. One of the key mechanisms of the DEI departments is usually the allowance of anonymous reporting of anybody, students, faculty, administration. Anybody can accuse anybody of anything anonymously, and you don't even know who your accuser is. And
Sure.
and if you do that once, and you have to go through this bureaucratic investigation process once, that's hours of your life gone. So now people like Jonathan Haidt don't even talk about things that, like Jonathan Haidt talks about this story of, goes to a bathroom, he sees the bias response team number, right in front of him in the bathroom, call this number to report people. And he's had students accuse him or submit these bias response claims and stuff like that. And that causes self-censorship, even without any kind of top-down exclusive, policy.
So like, again, I guess maybe there's a differentiation needs to be made between people who believe that DEI is a worthwhile consideration or something that's important to be paid attention to, and those people who are implementing policy, right? Like if you've got a faculty of 50-50 supporters and what's the opposite of supporter? Detractor. Excellent, good word. Yes, detractors of DEI. Impasse critic, yeah, sure. Then if I guess then voting reasonably on what policy changes should be made. Like I don't see why somebody necessarily holding a DEI idea or feeling that there's value in those ideas is just like cannot be tolerated. It's almost like we're saying this is a cursed ideology that its mere presence is too much to tolerate in these spaces, which is a very, very sort of dictatorial narrative, right?
Well,
like I understand how the paradox of tolerance can exist, right? You can't tolerate any tolerating anything except for things that are intolerant, right? That's the fundamentally, this seems to be like rubbing up against the paradox of tolerance.
Well, I understand it to mean that if you implement this policy of a DEI, and if you have what Reid just described, this anonymous reporting of people, and then you people who get reported at least get into trouble, and if they're reported repeatedly, I'm guessing that will make it a lot worse, and everyone will be suspicious of them. That will affect free speech. That I think that's what I understand Peter to be saying, that you will stifle free speech if you have this policy and you implement it, because people will not dare to say certain things anymore.
But DEI policy is not the same as people believing in DEI in principle, right? Like there's a distinction between, like, you couldn't. I can totally agree that you can't have free speech under. Well, okay, like I sort of feel like you could totally have an anonymous, like it's not the presence of the anonymous like tip line sort of reporting mechanism that's the problem. It's what's done in response to that. Like it's how it's what that goes towards, right? I can totally see a valid utility in having an anonymous reporting line. Students fearful of potential repercussions want to raise concerns, etc. But like what happens as a result of one of those reports coming in, and what kinds of reports warrant action? Those kinds of things definitely are like could be violently seriously concerning. I shouldn't say violently. But yeah, like how that policy is different. Like, so I guess I just wanted to differentiate between like having DEI like policies in place from having people who believe in DEI as members of the faculty. Like, those two things are very different, right? And it felt like he was saying like DEI just cannot be tolerated as an idea.
Well, he's probably right in the grand like culture of American universities. Like most universities that subscribe to these ideologies, their DEI offices do have sort of an outsized power to limit what people do and don't say. Like what Reid said, what Jonathan Haidt's story, one of the reasons he left was because of this. I think he did leave University of Virginia, but
he's still there. He just toned down his classes. Yeah.
Okay, right. And he's got some obviously fairly controversial beliefs about political ideologies, right? Like, but anyways, that at my school it wasn't like this. We had very diverse political classes, and if one of these institutions at like a larger, one of these DEI programs from a larger institution were installed at my school, I don't think I would have been able to take those classes. They wouldn't have survived. So I do think it's possible to have that middle ground, like what you're suggesting, Will. It just has to be to like, in some sense, like only really go after the most egregious of universally understood to be problematic situations.
I think there needs to be a proportional representation of those people deciding policy, right? Like if everybody if there's a minority in a position of power, here we go, and who can set policy, that they can set policy in line with their agenda, regardless of whether or not it's the majority opinion, or essentially they get the opportunity to wipe out and weed out the alternative opinion, so that it becomes a minority opinion and then becomes an extinguished opinion. So it's about, I guess, who controls the mechanisms of policy more than it is about people within the institutions holding these ideas. I think any policy that could be said to be in contradiction to the narrative of free speech could be maybe said as like, well, we can't do that. We could be. I think that would be an interesting rebuttal to some of this stuff. Like there needs to be some kind of charter, some kind of constitution, if you like, that says free speech is protected as an absolute principle, and that's a founding principle of this institution, and therefore it's a high order priority for us to maintain this position.
Let me just go on a quick rant on Popper's tolerance paradox, because I feel like what can you show that slide again?
Want that back, yeah.
Reid had it, yeah.
Yeah, because I think that is a fundamental problem with it. I mean, it's called a paradox, which is a pseudo contradiction, right? It's not an actual contradiction, but it seems like one. It's a paradox. And
no,
no,
I'm not sure I agree with that.
Okay. Well, what I'm getting at is, well, you could take that picture and circle this, what Popper actually said we must be intolerant of, and draw an arrow to that and say that's what Popper actually said we must be intolerant of. And because it was phrased in this way, we have to be tolerant of everything except intolerance. Well, then we're being intolerant towards something. We're being intolerant now. You are. Let me, before I read.
Go ahead.
You've been given some homework by Reid there.
let me finish my thought. I think it's just usually not helpful. People like to quote Popper on this, and I think you can basically justify sorts of intolerance that Popper would not have agreed should be tolerated. And I think it's just helpful to phrase it differently. Instead of saying we cannot tolerate intolerance, I think what Popper was actually getting at is we cannot tolerate anything that threatens open society, because he also that's the concept that Popper also came up with and described. Anything that threatens the core of open society. As long as it doesn't threaten the core of open society, we have to tolerate it. We don't have to accept it. And also, like, this distinction is also an important one: acceptance and tolerance, of course. And it oftentimes people talk about tolerance like something that we should strive for. But there are things that we should not just tolerate; we should accept. There are some things that we need to tolerate, even though we don't agree with them and we don't like them. And then there are some things that we mustn't tolerate because they threaten open society.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I know one of the key ideas here is that, you know, people need to be allowed to say what they think so that we can know whether we want to disagree with them or not, right? Like, if they're not allowed to express or externalize their bad ideas, how can we ever tell them that they're a fucking idiot and give them a good talking to, right? Like, so yeah, I fundamentally massively agree. And like, this is the thing, like, if in this dynamic we're seeing like the what's the acronym again? I've completely forgotten. The diversity DEI ideology, right? If the DEI perspective, let's say, these people setting these policies, and if these policies are breeding the gagging of people's ability to say things, right? That's tricky, because like a university it could not be true that a university professor would be allowed to say anything in a university campus and and teach it to students, right? Then there must be some limitations to what a university professor can teach. Is that am I falling down the slippery slope here, or I mean, there must be some kinds of limitations, right? Like,
their curriculum tends to be created by their department, so the specifics of what they teach, that's usually not in their control, with some exceptions. But like, how they say it and how they do it is usually up to them.
Right. Like, if a university professor was using the N-word liberally without any real need or reference to the training material, like, would that be a reason to have that university professor, at the very least, had a word with them, reprimanded, potentially lose their job if they were doing it in a callous fashion?
It probably depends on the school. If they were really using it in a derogatory way, I don't think very many universities would be open to that kind of thing. But I could see it being discussed academically.
Yeah. So I'm saying, like, absent academic context, right? They're just using it as part of their vernacular, it seems, right? And like, I could imagine that would be like, I don't think many people would say, well, that person, should be allowed to say what they like and do what they like. So I guess there are limits that we might recognize as to what university professors may or may not be allowed to say, or how they might act. And then the question, I guess, then comes into, like, well, what defines those limits, right? Clearly somebody expressing a view that a student finds challenging to the extent where they would want to complain about it shouldn't be sufficient, right? So it seems like it's the sensitivity to it seems like a disconnect between, like, the detection mechanism and the kind of sensitivity to specific issues. I imagine we've got another.
The irony is that
Reid here.
If that actually happened, it would not be up to the internal university's speech policies. It would be about, like, the backlash publicly. That would do the heavy lifting for you, right? You just subsume the cultural standards of speech patterns, and now there's no controversy. They deserve to go. But I think a big problem here is that we're imposing speech in a way that isn't organic to the culture environment.
So that in that situation, I would imagine that the uproar would not just be limited to the faculty member using this word. I think it would be, the criticisms would also be leveled at the institution for allowing him to, as if they could censor him preemptively. But the institution would take some of the blame for this, some of the accusations, some of the heat, some of the criticisms. Why are policies not put in place to solve this problem? This is kind of partly this is kind of touching back on what Reid was saying. What was that? You used wokeness relies on liberal charity, right? So there are some basic principles that we can accept, that we want some level of control, we want some level of intolerance to certain ideas being expressed in university schools. Like we would be angered if they weren't exercising some restrictions. But like where you draw the line now is kind of what we're discussing, and I think this is kind of where these ideological perspectives become almost argumentum ad absurdum, right? You start out with saying you can't say anything deliberately hateful or racist, to you can't say something that might reference something that somebody in the class might find triggering for some reason undefined, or at the moment they declare it to be triggering, you're now not allowed to engage with it. Or to use the exact same word in a different context, you're no longer allowed to talk about Huckleberry Finn as a work of American literature because it contains that exact same N-word, but you're now not allowed to even explore it or engage with it in an academic context.
Yeah, wokeness is now basically getting people fired and stuff by just mentioning words, even redacted versions of the words, like in asterisk in like school literature that they give out to students to learn the class. Like that's too far. No, like this is crazy.
You were frowning before it, Reid, when William said that there has to be some sort of limit, and then I think you was it you who brought up the slide, Reid, with the
limit for free speech.
Yeah.
What was the point again?
What is your position on? Should there be a line? Where should is this what should also be the line, that slide? Is this where we should draw the line when it comes to what we want to allow college professors to say on campus in while they're teaching, or because that is law, right? There are some things that are just illegal, incitement to violence, etc. But should everything that is legal to say be allowed to be said on campus by a professor?
No, there's like the illegal and then the protected speech, but in between there's like a taboo section, which I don't think you can fire a university professor for doing that, but you can, openly criticize them in liberal ways, like through a letter campaign, or even, expressing criticism on social media. But don't let that go too far into firing people. There should be taboo speech for sure.
That's basically the Overton window, right? What is
that? That's exactly what
Derek
was just. Yeah, this is exactly right. This is the Overton window.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is. This is good. I think this is. Clearly weaponizing this mechanism of saying, okay, we need to maintain. We need to prevent harm. Is a very, and again, like fundamentally, this is why John Stuart Mill always comes up in the space, right? Because fundamentally, John Stuart Mill says, like the limitations of freedom should extend, should be limited only by the point where it commits harm, which I think is again what you were showing on your diagram, Reid. But John Stuart Mill very explicitly stated, even when he wrote on liberty, he very explicitly stated when he talks about harm, he means physical, actual harm, not sort of asserted emotional harm, not kind of mental trauma, because he recognized in On Liberty that the moment you allow for this sort of mental trauma narrative, this kind of alternative version of harm, anybody can claim to be harmed. We cannot know what's in your mind. We cannot know, what might be triggering to you, right? And if we prohibit all speech based on the ability for any speech, but basically to potentially cause harm in somebody, we're no longer allowed to say anything, and like this limitation goes, you know, oh, here we go.
The man himself.
The man
Just Peter.
himself.
No.
What is he eating? Is that what time is it for you? Hey,
What's up,
Peter.
guys? Do you mind if I
Hey,
eat my
what's up?
cherries?
Oh, cherries. Okay,
Cherries.
fair enough. Is that cherries in milk?
No, I don't. I'm off of dairy except butter, but I put in either coconut milk or oat milk, but it's my I've stopped drinking, which was really quite something. So now, because I enjoy drinking so much, so I'm trying to limit my sugars, but I do allow myself a bowl of cherries every day, a large bowl, as you can see, of cherries filled with either oat milk or almond milk, and they're delicious. And I thought I had a podcast at 1, but it's at 1:30. We're exposing corruption in Wikipedia. That's our next project.
Oh, interesting. All right, cool. Yeah, I feel your pain with regards to giving up the drink. It's yeah, I've done that myself and still missing it like a fair bit.
Yeah, it's just I enjoy drinking. I enjoy cocktails. I enjoy complex flavors. But I'm telling you, the more research I read, and the older I get, and the more honest I am with myself, to the extent of being ruthlessly honest. Sugar's a fucking. Oh, can I swear, Reid?
Oh yeah, you get.
Sugar's a fucking toxin. It's poison. It's absolutely poison, and it's surprising to me. You know, I read something that Gary Taub said. He said, "Give a kid a lollipop, then take it away and see how he responds." But I know when I'm being honest with myself, when I'm not being honest with myself, I'm like, it's a little sugar. But when I'm really being honest with myself, I can feel the difference and I see it in my body, and I don't like what I see and I don't like the way it makes me feel. So now that I'm off of sugar, this is sugar in this, but it's not, it's different from, like breads and stuff. Anyway, I don't know why I'm talking about this. What's going on, guys?
No, it's all good, man. Well, yeah, we're just we're going through your interview with the Spectator chap, and yeah, we're pulling it apart. We're talking
Winston
about
Marshall.
Yeah, that's him. Yeah, it was a good interview, interesting interview, and like we're jumping all over the place now. We were just talking about John Stuart Mill and on liberty, limitations of speech, and sort of touching on that area. Honestly, you're saying a couple of sentences, and then we're going on a like 20-30 minute rant about like various different things, springing off that. So yeah,
it was a good interview. I also had a really good interview with Brendan Fraser, and I think someone told me that interview didn't take off, but I think the reason that interview didn't take off is because people like to see videos. They like to see people, and if there's a video component, and that was just audio component, but that interview is more cutting. But anyway, all right. Did you guys you want to talk about anything, or you just want to do what you're doing? I'll just sit in, or what?
Can I?
Yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just pose the same question that I just asked Reid to Peter? I just asked, what do you think? We just had this little slide that showed the kind of speech that is illegal, like incitement to violence and libel and all of these. Do you think that any university professor should be allowed anything that is legal to say, or do you think that there should be other limits to what a university professor should be allowed to say while they're teaching?
Well, it's interesting phrasing for that. Obviously, I do not think that university professors should be allowed to say anything illegal. And as far as I know, I believe it's federally illegal to threaten the life of a president. And there are other things, slander, etc., that obviously you cannot hide behind an academic cloak and make accusations, for example, that someone was raping children or something of the nature. But in terms of them saying things, I guess you would have to start. So I'm running through scenarios in my head, and like I'm thinking of like one scenario I would think of as, what would happen if a student raised their hand who was black, and then the teacher said shut up and then use the N-word.
Yeah, we literally were
No.
just talking about the N word.
Oh, were you? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that as far as I know, that's not federally illegal, or as far as I know, it's not even illegal by state. I'm not an attorney, but I don't think it is. I'd be very surprised if it were. And then the question is, what does doing that or not doing that impose upon someone's freedom of speech? I think that there are many ways that you can look at that. There are heuristics that you can think about in terms of how do you weigh those, and is that a limitation on freedom of speech, and does the fact that that's an immutable characteristic make a difference? So I think the N word is so charged. You know, when I was a kid, my grandma was from Italy. She was an Italian immigrant. She lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I used to spend the time with them because of illness in the family. She had ulcerative colitis. We used to go to the hospital a lot. I used to help take care of her. But the kids used to call me a wop. Have you heard that? Or guinea?
Yeah.
Do you even know what those terms are? Are they so outdated you don't know what they mean?
I don't know if they're I'm pretty old too, but yeah, I'm familiar with those terms.
Yeah. So it's probably best if we avoid the N word and talk about those, just because it's less charged and we may be able to think more clearly about those terms. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I guess the problem is like the sense that this is where we just were talking actually, is like the sensitivity to the N word like seems very justifiable. And I think it's very difficult to think of a reason why a professor would need to use that word out of context. But then the more absurd problem comes when they start banning
hold on.
very thin, right?
Hold on now. We're going to linger on something you just said.
Okay.
You said something very, very important, crucial, actually. You said out of context. Now, there's something in philosophy called the mention-use distinction, and this is extraordinarily important to understand. The mention-use distinction is the difference between mentioning something, a term, and using a term. Like Reid is standing to my left. So let's say I think in my head, Reid is all right. I'm going to get it out of the context of a pejorative altogether, and I'm going to use thin. So Reid is thin. So I say to you guys, Reid is thin. That's using it, right? Reid,
right.
You're thin. I just used the word thin. Now, mentioning it is if Reid is talking to someone else, for example, and Reid says, man, you know, I'm like 20 pounds underweight. I'm thin. I need to gain 10 pounds. And then I say to you guys, Reid said he's 20 pounds underweight. He's too thin. He needs to gain weight, 20 pounds. I didn't use the word thin. I mentioned the word thin. Now, this is extraordinarily important because what we've seen the move is you can't even, the word has become so taboo. Forget about using it. You can't even mention it. You have to use another word in place of the word that everybody already knows what it means, and they just translate it in their head. It's a kind of extra silliness. Like everybody knows what the word is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. That mentioned use distinction, I've not heard it framed like that, but that's a good. So in the context of a professor talking about Huckleberry Finn, is that? I mean, I guess that's tricky actually, because in some sense it's being used, but like, what you're not using the word, you're describing the name of a character, right? Because this is the absurdity, right, that seems to follow from this, right? We could recognize that if a professor uses, right, the term the N-word, right, in without context, that would be a transgression worthy of, at the very least, a stern letter. Yeah, possibly.
Let's say hold it because we need to proceed carefully with this conversation. So let's say that somebody says, "Oh, you know, in the history of," and they're reading from some paper, the history of racial epithets since, you know, I'm just making this, you know, 1860 on. And it's like, well, you know, in 1875, there's a prevalence of the word, you know, kike or something like that. No, it's going to be memed out 50,000 times. Boghossian said that word. if I'm a professor and I'm teaching a class and I say in 1890 or whatever, this word was very prevalent in these places. Activists want to conflate. They want to conflate mentioning a term with using a term.
Yeah.
So they don't even want, even if somebody now in Chinese. Now I don't speak Mandarin, but did you know this nega 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 when they say
yeah.
So professors who have been there's no relation to the N word etymologically or other. It's totally different. It's a completely different language.
There was the politician that was fired for saying niggardly.
Yeah,
term
that's
means,
a word.
Yeah,
that's a word, right?
And he was fired for that.
And there's no etymological similarity whatsoever. The different base roots. So the idea is that there's something so ghastly, so horrific, that even referring to the word brings up a kind of collectivized archetypal racial trauma inherent in people and perpetuates systemic power dynamics. So so those are conversations that we can be that need to be had. But I mentioned that because in the interview with Winston, it's an example of how people want to erode free speech, how people want to erode the ability. If you can't even talk about instances, I mean, what are you supposed to say? The W word for WAP, or the K word for kike, or if you can't even talk in an academic context, but there's something so, again, racially triggering about the word, then that's yet another way to shut down and control the discourse.
And I would agree. So I mean, I guess just going back to where we were with regards to how academic professors are treated, I think we agree there are limitations, right? If somebody is using it in an aggressive fashion, I think we could agree, as in there is no context and they are using that term deliberately. I think we could agree that that's something that's worthy of criticism and worthy of some rebuke.
Reprimand.
Yeah, and then I think so the question then is okay, well, we agree that there needs to be some limitations, and where's the line? And the problem with what we were describing as DEI, we were just learning about DEI somewhat today. Reid's been doing a good job, right? So
you have a lot to learn about because there's a lot there.
So it seems like these kinds of DEI policies that get put in place are just widening that Overton window, or maybe narrowing the Overton window, I guess, of what's allowed to be said, right? In such a way that we're now potentially firing or reprimanding members of faculty because of minor transgressions against
they're not even minor transgressions. There's someone else being offended by proxy,
right?
Or they're not even reprimands. Sometimes, in many cases, you just go under investigation and they call in everybody and they will ask the people questions that somebody else has told them. And I'm going to leave intentions entirely out of this, which is that's something else to talk about entirely. Again, this is a massive, massive discussion. So, or they'll call you in and they'll say, "Oh, what did you know about Dr. Boghossian beating his family?" "Oh, I don't know anything about it." "Oh, okay, thank you for visiting us. Thank you for coming." And then they'll call in the next person. They'll call in all your colleagues. They'll call in your TAs. They'll call in your former students. They'll call in people you haven't seen in 10 years. They'll call in your office mates. They'll call in the guy down the hall who's not in your department. "What do you know about Dr. Boghossian beating his family?" "I've never heard of it." "Oh, okay, thank you." And now all of a sudden, why is everybody that knows this guy, they wouldn't be calling them in unless is this guy beating his wife and children? I mean, doesn't he have a daughter that's adopted from China? Is he beating her? What's going on with that?
And then
it's a campus rumor, right?
Right. That's
what happens when there's no due process in Title IX investigations.
Right. Right.
I just thought of this distinction, this mention use distinction. That was they made fun of that. Monty Python made fun of that in Life of Brian already, right?
Yeah.
With Jehovah. Oh, he said Jehovah now. Now we have to stone him. And I also I think I always have to think of Voldemort. You are kind of like giving power to that word. You are by banning it completely. and saying he who must not be named, you are giving him this word more power, and that's what I always think of. And even in Harry Potter, I think Harry was never afraid of it. He just used the name, and that was like kind of like portrayed as brave and the right thing to do, right?
It's inviting you to bend the knee to the narrative that word has that power,
right?
Or be held accountable in the court of public opinion in a way that's deeply unfair.
Prophecy. If you say it has power, it will have power.
One thing, Peter, while we've got you, like I think one thing we were just talking about was like, and I think this has come up in chat a few times, and it's something I was sort of defending you a bit, and I don't want to make that too familial, but I was sort of suggesting that part of the challenge we've got here is like, it seems like oftentimes when you're talking about like woke issues, like when you're addressing woke issues, and some of this comes across, I think, in the Spectrum SE that you've been doing with Reid, like I think there's a deep, genuine sense of like frustration and dislike and somewhat disdain for these narratives. And I think that sometimes that can come across as being like dismissive of the people holding those narratives, like a failure of empathizing with the individual you're talking to, because clearly this stuff has been really frustrating for you. And specifically as a philosophy professor, I imagine navigating this space, I can imagine it's even more difficult, right? You're there specifically to talk about ideas and challenge, thinking tools and try to induce some better way, challenge people fundamentally. And so, yeah, I think this frustration, I can see why it builds up, but it seems like it also comes across to a lot of people, including myself quite often, as you being deeply uncharitable to the people that might hold these views.
That's because you're correct. And I'll explain why that is. So let me give you a specific example. So yesterday, so unless you swim in this pond, there's no way I could explain this to you, because you will think, oh, that's just a conspiracy. Because I don't even know how long this podcast has been going on, but I left to get some Vietnamese food, and I knew Reid was going to be on this. But I bet you already, you guys have talked about something being a conspiracy.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier.
Okay,
yeah.
So there we go.
Yeah.
So unless you're familiar with this world, things seem like a conspiracy. These are not conspiracies. They're far from conspiracies as you can be. We have people literally screaming at the rooftop what their intentions are. Everybody ignoring them and saying, these could not possibly be their intentions. I'll just give you a quick parallel. There are some people who believe in talking snakes. No, they're not. Nobody believes in a talking snake. Nobody. Or some people want to defund the police. Nobody wants to defund the police. Nobody wants it. Nobody. This is a total. Brandon Johnson, the mayor who's elected Chicago, he doesn't want to defund all the statements about defunding the police. So people are incredibly clear about what they want to do. They're incredibly clear about how they want to do it. Social justice ideology is disrupt and dismantle. Yet people, with no disrespect, people like yourselves who do not swim in the pond try to be thoughtful, reasonable, probably have liberal sensibilities. And at some level, I guarantee you are saying there is no possible way people could think this. It is too fucking stupid.
Oh, no. I think that I know. I mean, I wouldn't say there is no way people can think this. But I think one thing that's worth doing, and I think you would recognize, right, that we need to separate what people are doing, like from their motivation. What is that? So one component of this woke narrative, right? There seems to be an awful lot of political ideology that's wrapping up in these mimetic facade, right? These mimetic ideas are being bolted on top of this underlying like political ideology, right? And a lot of people are being infected by the mimetic component of this and running around and championing it. Those people, like, genuinely, I suspect, deserve to be like empathized with, right? Because they aren't standing on that sort of political ideologically driven narrative.
Okay,
right? They're standing on the empathy narrative.
No,
right?
no.
They get there through empathy.
No. So I disagree. So let me give you an example, and you can take it. And then I want to make a minor commitment to social justice before my interview begins. So yesterday we're at University of Eugene, and we did this thing. I don't know if you follow this at all, but with this guy called Billboard Chris and James Klug, and it was pretty intense. So we went out. He wears a billboard, and the billboard says, children cannot consent to puberty blockers. Now, to be clear, the most important word in that whole thing is children. right? We're not talking about 19 or 18-year-olds. We're talking about people under the age of 18. Okay. So I go there, and this woman comes up to me and kind of physically separates me from the crowd. Reid was filming this. And this guy, Billboard Chris, his Twitter handles at Billboard Chris. If you want to see these clips of the thing, I think there's actually examples of something I'm talking about. And this goes to your point, is it, William?
Yeah.
This goes to your point. So this person comes up to me, and she starts immediately asking me seemingly reasonable questions. So that if anybody here had listened to these questions, they'd be like, well, why is Boghossian so dismissive of those questions? The questions are, well, tell me about your dissertation. What was your dissertation on? What we're doing? These are not honest people. These are not honest questions. This woman does not want to know the first fucking thing about my dissertation. She doesn't want to know who I studied with. She doesn't want to know all of the other myriad questions. She is doing this as a tactic to disrupt and dismantle.
Okay.
She wants to disrupt the event. She believes that the event is perpetrating harm against trans people. However, if you're not familiar with these tactics that people use, you would see that and you're like, oh my God, that guy wrote How to Have Impossible. Why isn't he patient with her? Why doesn't he spend the time and actually talk to her about her dissertation? Why? Well, because their whole objective is to move me out of that arena. And so when you see my frustration, it's because I know exactly what's going on, because it's the same playbook, because I've seen it literally tens, not thousands of times, tens of thousands of times. But externally viewing that, and yes, it is a source of frustration. And another source of frustration that, again, if you're not familiar with this space, is the Mott and Bailey. It comes up over and over and over again. But if you're seeing it like you guys and you're not living it, then you're like, oh, well, what's wrong with inclusion? Why isn't Boghossian is he some kind of a Nazi? You know, yesterday people were calling me Nazis. This guy must be a Nazi. He doesn't want what? He doesn't want black people included, people in wheelchairs, and he's getting frustrated. No, I'm getting frustrated because they know what they're doing, because they're lying. When this woman comes over and asks me about my dissertation, she doesn't give a fuck about my dissertation.
I hear you. I think I totally don't deny that that's the experience you're having, right? And there will be a lot of people out there that will be in that position where they're doing this kind of deliberate, interventions. They're applying a strategy with a goal that's hidden, a hidden agenda. But there are lots of people, I think, that can get behind a lot of these agendas just purely empathetically, right? They're not necessarily, they have no idea about the academic or the political ideological background for this stuff.
Correct.
And they're motivated purely to support these movements just entirely on the basis of empathy, right? They empathize with their fellow human being. So they're fundamentally nice people, right? Like one of the things that's kind of weird about this is you'd have to be a reasonably nice person by, I think, a modern sort of judgment of what that might mean, like to support these ideological perspectives. So you've got potentially nice people championing what they genuinely believe to be a good idea. Like,
let me pause you right there, because
good.
Because again, I think it's really important to proceed with caution and carefully in this conversation. So I was going to tweet this at lunch, but I have too many fucking emails to do, so I didn't do it. So one of the things that you see over and over again, or that I saw, and you can ask Reid about his experience with this to see if it's commensurate with my own. So I'll just give you two examples, again, from the Billboard Chris yesterday. So Chris will say something like, they'll say to Chris, again, I just want to go over the claim. The claim is children cannot consent to puberty blockers. So person after person will come over, after you get rid of the Nazis and all this stuff, the people who want to come over and ask questions will say, like, this isn't happening. You guys are some right-wing maniacs that are just making stuff up. And so Chris will go through the studies and he'll say, this is happening, this is happening, this is where it's happening. He'll give the citations. He'll say, it's on my webpage. You can go to the evidence. You can read this author. And then they'll make an immediate switch. It's like the word faith. From my faith is true to my faith is beneficial, without having acknowledged that their faith is true. Yeah. They will say, it's a good thing that's happening. Whereas literally a minute before his explanation, they're saying to him, it doesn't happen. So I do, William, take issue with that. I think it's such a profoundly dishonest stance and position. I would agree that they're not intimately familiar with the grievance studies literature. Many of these people happen to fit a certain demographic. I believe that they have an impulse toward the good. And as Steven Pinker said, the overriding impulse towards the good is what makes people do bad things. But what I don't do, what my point of disagreement, and if I've misconstrued this, then I'm sorry, is I don't think fundamentally at core you're seeing an example of people who are discharging their positive moral impulses because they believe they're making the world a better place.
I don't know if that's true. Like, I don't know how we would know that would be true. Like,
Well,
you
because
mentioned before,
they're dishonest. Because
you
they wouldn't change their mind then, right? They wouldn't say, well, okay, you know what? You were right. This is happening. I made a mistake, but it's still a really good thing. It's still a good.
Your analogy with religion was a perfect one, though, right? Because we've seen this exact same move in religious conversation. Like, we have these conversations with religious people, they make that exact same move, right? I don't think it's any more motivated from like obviously we defend ourselves psychologically, right? We represent an idea, we would externalize that idea. We now want to maintain consistency with the idea we've externalized. And so when we find ourselves put into a corner in a conversation, we find our ideas being challenged by, as you were saying, evidence and research, right? This guy clearly had receipts for the claims he was making. Now they want to change the game. They want to make that, like, in some ways, just making them do that, like making them realize that they have to shift the way they're framing this argument. Like, in some ways, I think is a victory, right? They have to acknowledge, they had to have noted. They may not notice they've done it, but I think they might have noticed that they haven't.
Okay,
to do that.
So would you agree then that they don't hierarchically prioritize honesty with themselves? That isn't a core value. Because it was a core honesty with themselves and others. Because if it were a core value, they'd say, you know what? I didn't know the literature as well as I thought it was.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume you're telling the truth, but you could be bullshitting me. I'm going to look myself. And if it's the case, I'm going to change my mind. That wasn't a value in there.
Yeah. Consistency for them will be a higher value for sure. Consistency with what they think. I mean, part of the, you must have heard this. I've heard this a load. You must have heard this. I don't know how to argue with you. I don't agree with you, but I don't know what to say. I'm an impasse, right?
Yeah.
They're not conceding the point. They're not saying, you know what, and maybe I've got some thinking to do. They still want to be right, but they don't want to they don't want to concede, but they just don't know how to proceed at this point, right?
So then my response to that would be, thank you. I really appreciate you being honest with me.
Sure, I agree.
Is it a reasonable thing to say then maybe you don't know? Maybe the belief you hold could be false. Is that a reasonable thing to say? But there's something in the architecture of this particular belief set, and I got to go. I do have to go in a minute. I do want to commit some social justice before my interview. There's something in the nature of this belief set. This is why they don't want to have conversations. This is why they don't want to talk. My strong suspicion is not for extensive reasons that they provide, saying, I'm not going to platform you. In every discourse, there's a power imbalance. You're using this to perpetuate white supremacies. I don't talk to Nazis. I think that's window dressing. I think ultimately at core, they have not done the intellectual work to figure out just one example, if children are being given puberty blockers, and instead of approaching that conversation with humility and saying, well, I have a feeling about this, I don't really know the data, my feeling is that children should be able to consent, or no, excuse me, my feeling is that this isn't happening, and that this is so we have something else going on that's preventing, as Reid's Twitter bio says, which I just love so much, blocking the way of inquiry. And then we have everybody else blowing bullhorns, or what were all these people doing speaker things, Reid, right? So that we couldn't have a talk, or driving a bicycle in so that, all you need to do is just think about it like this. If you were to say to somebody like, hey, it doesn't matter what it is the sun, light, or heat. It's an example from Gurdjieff. For what happens when you inside of a carburetor. I personally have no idea what happens inside of a carburetor. But if someone was contesting the fact that I barely know what a carburetor is, that a carburetor does what it should do, all you would need to do is have some guy who knows about carburetors, or woman, come in and talk about carburetors. There's no reason to blow a bullhorn when a guy's trying to explain what a carburetor does.
There's a component of self-righteousness to these ideas, and I think that self-righteousness comes from the fact that they arrive at these positions empathetically. And I think any resistance to a position that you've arrived at through empathy will seem like hostility, which is, and so they're in a position, they're holding this position that they've gotten to empathetically. They've been taught that this is a good value, like equality is a good thing, and that any resistance to that is inherently evil.
And you have one more component. You have one more component that's essential to talk about this. You have the community-based component. I call it ideologically motivated moral communities. You have the moral communities of which they're a member. Everybody, and when you see the videos, everybody's high-fiving each other, slapping each other on the back. You are a member of a tribe of other people who share these beliefs. Of course, there's a built-in incentive and disincentive motivation to retain the belief, or at the very least to give the verbal behavior that you retain the belief. But listen, guys, it's been fun. I have to commit some social justice. Reid's going to be here, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks, man.
Take care, mate. Bye.
I'll be back.
Ah, so much more to talk about.
Yeah,
but fun. Yeah, now we just got Reid. He's like the worst one. Welcome back, Reid. They were saying mean things about you. What's that T-shirt? Is that a
CCP Grey?
CCP Grey T-shirt.
Yeah.
What is it? GP Grey?
CGP Grey.
CGP Grey. Right. That was fun. That was interesting. But I'm not sure.
Isn't like this what Peter just described? That people don't really value honesty as much as they should. Isn't this the reason why street epistemology was created to begin with? Like, we know that there are beliefs
that's what I was trying to get to.
Right. We know that there are beliefs that you feel connected with, that you identify with, and that's not understanding how a corporator works is not one of those beliefs. But believing that puberty blockers are not being given to children, that is, like you said, it's a moral belief. It has to do with the community. I agree with that. Yeah. We are a community. We high five each other when we're talking about this. So
the analogs with religion are just huge.
It's also
right?
dishonest. It's dishonest to pretend like we're not doing it, like we're immune to it. There are certainly different degrees to which you are being intellectually dishonest, or to which you're unaware of these logical fallacies, and you fall victim more easily or less easily. But still, no one is immune to this. And
But I think fundamentally, like, there seems to be such a strong correlation between this ideological belief system that seems to be like being held, like these thinking tools have become an ideology, right? So however they've arrived at them, whatever degree that they're holding them, like the analog with a religious perspective, or the way you might argue with somebody's religious perspective, or say argue, you might talk to somebody about their religious perspective. It seems so analogous, right? They have the same groupthink, they have the same like community grounding, they have the same strong motivation to deny observed reality in favor of holding on to their position, right? All of these things are the same. And SE seems to have been like demonstrated time and time again to be a very simple and elegant tool for helping somebody notice something that's inconsistent in the way that they're holding their epistemology. So it seems
for people willing to talk to you and go through the liberal process of conversation, not blow air horns in your face. You can have a conversation with them.
Right.
Yeah, that seems to be more of the problem, is that people having, sensible intellectual conversations over the people that are just, the masses that, appeal to whatever, political or religious or ideologies that they have.
Well, I think...
this is something Peter gets to later, right? Is like his view is that they're just not willing to listen. Fundamentally, they're just not willing to listen, and you can't have a conversation with somebody not willing to. I just feel like. I feel like at some point, if you're at a rally, right? I think Abstract Activist talked about this once. He said he went to a rally for something. I don't even know what it was, some political rally, and it was kicking off everywhere. And he went there and he said he was trying to use SE to try to talk to some of the people in. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, that is clear. Like, how is this a place where you can have a conversation like that and it be in any way effective? Like, adrenaline's going to be going. emotion is going to be running high. There's blood in the air. Like it's just not going to be a place where anybody's not going to want to fight, like intellectually or otherwise, for their position. I think part of the problem would be that you're going into these spaces that are inviting of these kinds of. I guess you're kind of going to the riot, Reid, in some ways, right? And then saying, "Hey, these people can't be talked to." Well, I mean, yeah, sure, maybe at the riot they can't be talked to, but maybe as individuals, as in a separate space, and maybe they can be talked to there.
Yeah. Should the response from PSU students to 3 people walking in the public square at PSU, one guy with a sandwich board that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers, the response should be people maybe gathering around, maybe a little bit of loud voices, but the response should be conversation, not attempting to expulge them from the space and interrupting other people's conversations about that issue. It should ideally be liberal. And it can be heated. Just have conversation. Don't disrupt in conversation.
And I would agree that the social norms. Sorry, I just want. I'll make this point very quick. The social norms and clearly the discourse conventions in universities have broken down to the extent where this has become a problem, right? So the fact that we might characterize this as the metaphorical riot where you're trying to have this conversation, like that is a problem, like no doubt. But I don't know that that's the same as saying the people that hold this position are uncommunicatable with, right? Sure, they're uncommunicatable with in those spaces, right? And I agree, those spaces shouldn't be a place where that is the case. But there's no argument there. But there's a big difference between saying that when we go to those particular spaces that have become somewhat lawless, intellectually speaking, or at least heavily policed, perhaps is a better way of saying. I think that we can't have those conversations in those spaces. I think that's very different from saying those people can't be spoken to. We can't use the tools of SE with those people at all. I think that's a big difference.
Or to make it more clear, I think that imagine all the people who were willing to talk about their religious beliefs to you, Reid, to Anthony, to anyone who does street epistemology. Imagine instead of approaching them or them approaching you and saying, hey, you want to talk about something that's an important belief to you, deeply held belief, okay, you want to pick one, blah, blah, and they have the conversation. Instead of doing that, you go to their, let's say, their church, and you set up a table and you say, God is not real. This is the claim, let's talk about it. People will not react the same way. There will probably be people who want to disrupt the conversation, who want to stop it from happening in the first place. And I think, like William said, it shouldn't be like your university campus should not be like a church of people who want to stop people from having these kinds of conversations. But still, it doesn't mean that people are completely unable or unwilling to have the conversation. It's just not the right setting to do that, just like with the believers, the God believers, who are willing to have the conversation once they're in the right space. And you're just talking one-on-one, and it's not like a big thing, not a big event that people notice.
I would quibble with the analogy. I think a university space is the perfect place, even in
should be the perfect place.
It should be the perfect place, and I would hope I would have higher standards for university students than congregants of a church.
But I think what you're demonstrating is that there is a massive failure in it maintaining its status as the perfect place for this kind of conversation. Yeah. And to demonstrate that is to demonstrate perhaps some terrible consequence of this particular philosophical position that they seem to be adopting, right? Politically motivated or whatever. But the reality is that I just worry that leads to what Peter, I think, says later in the video, which is that you just can't talk to these people. The people that hold this. I just fundamentally disagree with that. And it seems such. I can, I can be empathetic to Peter feeling frustrated and feeling tired of having to engage with this stuff and just not having it in him, perhaps, for to go through it yet again with another student screaming in their face and just not wanting to listen. That's going to wear anybody down.
Yeah.
Well,
But that's a good reason not to go to the universities to do this.
Yeah, I gotta go. Love the conversation. Definitely will continue. But I gotta help record a podcast.
Yeah, no problem, Reid. Thanks for your time, mate.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
See you, Reid.
Have a good day.
So just a question for the room, right? We've got quite a lot of video left, and we've been going for 3 hours. How are you guys feeling? What are your thoughts on what you want to do moving forward? We can press on through. We can continue to chat. I'm happy either way. So Janos, what are your thoughts? Go, no go?
I just saw that Sushi wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry, Sushi.
I was going to say, onto your point about these people not wanting to talk. I think that was, what Boghossian was saying about, the idea of people believe in talking snakes as a, there's no way that people can actually believe that. And I think that's what he's saying, is that there are, in fact, people out there, in this particular space that are that extreme, where they aren't actually looking at they're digging into their beliefs and having an honest conversation. They just want to be on that bullhorn and scream. And we have to be realistic. There are just those people, in the same way that there's the street preachers that aren't there to have an intellectual conversation with you about their belief in God.
Let me address that. Right. Yeah, totally. I agree. Right. If some, like, this is part of the problem with like some of the postmodernist narratives, right? Because at the moment you start to say, okay, well, I define truth differently, then suddenly, like, it's functionally impossible to have a conversation with that person, right? The moment we stop connecting to this idea of a shared reality, like when people, for example, and I don't believe that most of the time when we hear this in SE, they really mean it when they say it. But if somebody really did mean it, I think this would be another example, like where people say, I've got my reality and you've got your reality, right? What they're really saying most of the time when they say that is, I just want you to stop attacking my position and I will respect you and just leave me alone, and we'll just go into our own corners and not bother each other, right? But some people might genuinely believe that that we're all in this kind of like bubble reality that means that there are things that are true for me that might not be true for you, etc., and that our reality is what we make of it. Like, if they truly believed that, this would be another example of somebody who has positioned themselves into a space where it would be very difficult to talk to them, except to point out that they probably don't hold that epistemic, they don't use that epistemic framework to navigate most of their life. Like they probably do, whether they know it or not, or admit it or not, and use some kind of much more shared reality type epistemic framework to navigate most of what they do in society.
And that's usually what people like, for example, Anthony does. He just starts talking about that, and then like, oh, so there are some things where we share a reality. It's not just personal truth and for everyone. What's the difference? How do we? And you can still have a conversation. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it makes it more difficult for sure.
There's a famous who's that guy? There's a famous American black guy who goes around. I've forgotten his name completely. It's completely left my mind. But he's famous for having conversations with KKK members and getting people out of the Klan. Does anybody remember his name?
Yes. Hold on. Daryl Davis.
Daryl Davis, thank you.
Daryl Davis,
so he's having these conversations with KKK members, right? As an African American, right? He's going out there and having thank you, everybody else who gets it. Nobody else. I was the main person who didn't know. Thank you. Yeah, everybody's got it. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So, if Daryl Davis can talk to, like, KKK members are going to be motivated to think that anything that he says can be dismissed a priori, right? Anybody that holds that position, right, really holds it, right, can say anything this person says is like, if you really dehumanize somebody and you say this person's something, you can't trust anything they're saying. Like, how much worse must the ideological barriers be for like this particular woke agenda? If Daryl can have a conversation with KKK members, why can't we potentially get through to these people? And I acknowledge, right? I totally acknowledge that if somebody is just entirely not willing to listen to you, and just broadcasts all the time, and just isn't at all listening to anything you're saying, and is just rejecting everything that you're saying on the basis that you're saying it. And if it doesn't agree with the narrative, then that's hard. It's really hard. But then you just have to connect to the human being underneath it, and that's why empathy is so important. And the moment you can make an empathetic, I think Daryl Davis talked about the fact he used to use music like he used to talk about music with a lot of these KKK members because it's all of a sudden you've just shifted the frame of the conversation enough, and you can talk to a human being, and they realize that they're talking to a human being, and that changes it. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that it is like necessarily impossible that you can't necessarily have these conversations with these people. It's that, like Chase had mentioned, a bullhorn is a lot more effective, right? Yelling on a bullhorn, you can address, hundreds to thousands of people, where in order to, engage with, that extremist that's in the KKK, you literally need to sit down with a single individual and have a very nuanced conversation that may start off talking about music to make any headway towards, a more an appropriate held belief.
Yeah,
William,
I agree.
You really need to watch the movie Accidental Courtesy, or the documentary about Daryl Davis.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah, it's pretty
Accidental
good.
Courtesy. What a great title.
Yeah. And that's by the way, that was the way that he connected with the first KKK member. He's a musician, and he was playing music, and this
Right, and he came to visit him, right?
Yeah, this guy
Yeah.
walked up to him after his performance and said, I nenever knew that a N-word could, and he didn't say N-word.
I don't think he said the N-word.
Was capable of playing music this beautiful, and then they started connecting over music and jazz music, but I
just think it's such a dangerous move to make, to say that somebody can't be spoken to, can't be reached, can't be done. Like the moment you've said that, like you've made it true. Do you know what I mean? Like the moment it's not easy to reach everybody at all times and in all places, right? Like the conversation, doing SE in the middle of a riot is clearly going to be extraordinarily ineffective, right? So there's that caveat, but I think the idea that we could just say that no, people with this ideology cannot be spoken to, cannot be argued with, cannot be talked out of it. I just feel that that's really, really dangerous.
Even going to a campus, like I think this assumption that you can go to a campus and have a sign or set up shop and do what these Spectrum SE videos that Peter is doing is somehow not equivalent to trying to have a conversation at a riot. But it's clear that they're not. Like you go and you have this sign that's clearly meant to get attention and provoke people, and that's what trolls do. If you're a college student, you out of every 20 people that come to your campus doing that, you'd be lucky to find one that's doing it honestly. So of course you're going to immediately assume that they're, and they've got cameras and they're calling you out for walking by, that they're trolls. That's the obvious intuitive reaction. That's not a place for a conversation. So I'm surprised that there seems to be this instinct that, okay, well, a college campus is somehow different from a rally or a riot. When you come in trying to provoke reactions like that. If this is why Anthony has successful conversations on college campuses and Peter couldn't with his Spectrum SE, because the approach was intrinsically hostile.
Different. But even with Anthony, when I first saw Anthony's videos, I kind of suspected it was going to be a kind of Steven Crowder style Change My Mind, where this guy comes in with his heavily rehearsed talking points and just owns the wokes, or owns the libs or whatever the hell it is, right? Like I genuinely, the optics of Anthony, and Anthony's just standing there on his own with his clipboard in his hand, right? And his GoPros placed all over the place, and actually doesn't really strongly convey that. But that was my first judgment based on what I saw. Like guy at a campus with cameras pointing at him, has a clipboard in his hand, clearly there to talk to people, wants to talk about religious views. All of a sudden, like my suspicion meter was just filling up. I was just like, okay, this looks dodgy.
Of course, because when people are standing there trying to start talking to people, what do they want something? They have some sort of agenda, and usually they want to sell you something.
Yeah.
And if it's not like an actual product, at least it's an idea or a belief or an opinion, but they want to get you to take something from them or to give you something. And it's just so rare that people generally just want to have a conversation and understand. that understanding, maybe mutual understanding, or you understanding yourself better, that is the goal. How often does that happen? Right?
Yeah, I
So
agree.
it's natural. Like when I go out and do SE every once in a while, and sometimes I do it at the park, and if I just put up my table, I should get like some sort of sign or something so that it's clear from a distance what I'm doing. But if I'm just sitting there with cameras, no one's approaching me, so I go around, ask people, hey, you feel like having a conversation, and some people will agree, but still, like, I'm not conveying anything in the direction of I want to sell you something, but that's the first assumption that you will have.
If somebody comes up to you in the street and says, "I'd like to talk to you," can I ask you about your politics, right? Or can I ask you about your religious views? Doesn't mean like the chances are they just want to tell you about their politics or tell you about their religious views. I think I would question, like, here's a potential way of thinking about this. Like, I don't think street epistemology is a tool that you take to war. Like, I don't think it's a weapon that's wielded in those spaces, right? I think street epistemology is incredibly effective because it sort of, at least it could be incredibly effective. Let's say, I think that if it was adopted more widely, I think it's a mindset shift, right? That's the objective of street epistemology isn't really to conversate everybody out of a bad idea, but actually to convert people into a just literally having a higher standards for the things that they believe, and have some tools to help them navigate that. That's what it's really about, right? Like, we want people to have those thinking tools, right? But I don't, and so I think that's what the street epistemology movement is about, or should be about. Encouraging, inspiring reflection in other people, I guess, is how I normally reframe it. But I guess what we're really trying to do is inspiring them to reflect, right? Like, it's not, I don't want to be the tool that does the reflection, or makes the reflection happen. I want them to notice that reflecting on the reasons they hold a position is a good thing. It's worth challenging those views. Yeah, it's interesting. So guys, seriously, what do you want to do? We're 3 hours, 10 minutes into this podcast. We've got probably, oh gosh, like
anything else.
We've got probably at least another 40 minutes of Peter in this thing. What do you feel that you want to do? Should we I think we've had a great stream. If we wanted to end it now, I wouldn't object. But if we want to carry on and push on through, I'm willing to be here for it. Like, 3 hours streaming for most people is just like not even getting started. So it depends how you feel about these things. So Janos, how do you feel? Go, no go, or neutral?
I would be good with ending it here.
Okay, you're a
if
no-go?
you guys want to go a little bit longer, then that's fine by me. But yeah.
Cool, gotcha. Sushi?
I've got to let the dogs out and go to the bathroom. I'd be okay to go for another hour, but then I would like to go for a walk.
I got you.
So I'd be down for another hour.
Noah, what's your thoughts?
I should probably get some work done today.
I think it's probably a good time to end it then, guys. And I think that's perfectly valid under the circumstances. I think there's some really good fun stuff to get to, so maybe we'll pick this up as a part 2 at some point. But yeah, really enjoyed the conversation. It was super fun. It was exactly what I hoped it was, which is like a good jumping off point for lots of maybe interesting conversations. And I feel bad because I think Noah was like, well, the interesting part of this video that I'm here for is like the last half, but we're not even nearly close to that.
It's okay.
Honestly, yeah, guys, really appreciate the time. Thanks for jumping in. Thanks everybody in chat. I'm so sorry that it's really hard to have these conversations and pay attention to chat at the same time. So please don't think I'm ignoring you. It was great to see everybody. Yeah, thanks very much, Mighty Moonworm. Always a pleasure, sir. Thanks to everybody. Honestly, guys, it's been super fun. Let's do it again sometime. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, does anybody have anything they want to sell, plug, promote? Janos, do you want to just say goodbye, or just anything to promote?
No.
Message for posterity? No, you good? Okay, fantastic.
Well, maybe. Okay. Well, if you're asking me to, well, if
I literally was asking you.
If you're German speaking and you're interested in street epistemology, then contact us on Discord or wherever, because we have this German SE group and German speaking.
Excellent. I don't want to encourage these things. I'm just going to type this message in. No, anything you want to tell anybody? Any parting messages?
I wish, but I have nothing to sell. Nothing to
Fantastic.
plug.
No problem. How about you, Sushi?
Don't drink alcohol, don't smoke, don't do drugs, and eat your broccoli.
God damn it! This is become very boring. This is not the podcast I wanted ever. This is Deviant Robot. God damn it,
Ragnar.
I'm going
Ragnar
to suggest.
saying-
I'm going to
yes,
suggest
Street
everybody takes a
Epistemology.
look at this. Take a look at discord.gg/deviantrobot for our Discord channel. Thanks to everybody who has helped us make that something that we can now use as a URL for Discord. But yeah, come join the conversations over there at our Discord channel. That would be awesome. Ragnar is suggesting what? What's Ragnar suggesting?
Plug
Oh,
the
plug the
Street
Street Epistemology
Yeah.
Discord server. So I think that would be discord.gg/Street Epistemology, all one word. Is that right? Ragnar, do you have the short URL by any chance? Anything handy? I'm gonna.
Well-
if you can post it in chat, mate, I will make sure it's on screen. Yeah. So discord.gg/deviantrobot. I think that the SE one is just discord.gg/Street Epistemology, all one word, no spaces. You can find the SE server. It's a lovely bunch of people just like us hanging out there. So yeah, do recommend it. Cool. Any more?
If you can,
We good?
if that's not the right link to the Discord, then go on streetepistemology.com and there's the link to the Discord, I think.
I got you. Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Fantastic. Wait, what? We currently have one sub missing. Oh, really? God damn. Wait, are you saying Deviant Robot has got more subs than the SE channel? Hashtag shouldn't be proud of that, but sort of slightly am. Actually, fantastic, excellent. I love sushi. Wow, I'm not sure I appreciate it. This is concerning. I'm not sure I should encourage such things. Right, everybody, you're all horrible. Love you lots. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.